Hey everyone, and welcome to the first episode in a brand new series, React for Absolute Beginners. In this series, we'll learn how to operate the React JavaScript framework, which is currently the most popular JavaScript framework in the world at the time this video is being made. If you want to make professional grade web apps, this tutorial is for you. By the end of this course, you'll learn a huge array of topics. You'll learn how to build React components, how to use React State, how to conditional render, and so much more. Piece these things together, and you'll be well on your way to becoming a React developer. In this first episode, I want to quickly go over what React is and what it's used for, how to set up a project in React, and what the project environment looks like. So without any more waiting, let's get started. If you're only interested in getting the project set up, you can go ahead and skip forward in the video. Otherwise, I want to take 1 or 2 quick minutes to give you some background on React. Back whenever web development first popped up a couple of decades ago, HTML was the only language able to be used on a web page. HTML was great as a markup language, but it lacked customization and styling to really make web pages look nice. A few years after HTML was invented, CSS came out, which allowed web developers to actually customize their HTML content to look nicer. With CSS, developers were able to style pages with colors, nice spacing, and all sorts of other formatting tools. Now that pages were customizable, the new problem then became that web pages weren't interactive and couldn't do very much on their own. And that's where JavaScript came in. JavaScript looks like many other mainstream programming languages and allows developers to write code that can interact well with HTML and CSS to create interactive pages that users could potentially do things with. Users can click on buttons, open up images or videos, or route between pages, and this has been standard since. HTML, CSS, and JavaScript all combine to make most web pages you see on the internet today. However, in the last couple of years, as the web has become increasingly more complex, developers have found that creating large web apps that need to be super dynamic and flexible is simply very challenging just using JavaScript to interact with HTML and CSS, and this is where React comes in. React is a JavaScript framework created by Facebook in 2013. React is meant to solve the shortcomings of vanilla JavaScript, which is creating apps that can be dynamic and flexible while being easily scalable. React has gained popularity in recent years because of these factors, and many developers find it to be a very well-rounded framework, hence why it is currently the most popular JavaScript framework in the world. So what is React not? React is not a programming language like JavaScript or Python. React is not competing with JavaScript because it is built off JavaScript and uses JavaScript to run all of its functionality. Think of it like this. It's possible to build a house using just a hammer and some other basic tools, but it's not ideal. It's easier to build a house if you're using heavy machinery that can get the job done quicker and better. So think of JavaScript like the basic tools and React as the heavy machinery. If you want to build nice, scalable, and flexible web pages and don't want to gouge your eyes out while you're doing so, then React is for you. Now, one final note before we get started with this course. I'd like to emphasize that this is not a course for HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. In this course, I'm going to assume you have a basic understanding of HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, as React uses elements that relate to all 3 of these things. You don't have to be experts in any of them to watch this course, but you should at least know what they look like and what they do. A working knowledge of JavaScript will help out a lot with this course, however. So let's work on getting your React project set up. There's going to be a couple of things you need to do before we get started. First, you need to install a code editor where you can actually modify and run your React code. I highly recommend Visual Studio Code as it's super easy to use and has tons of customization with external libraries and packages that you can install. You can install it by going to code.visualstudio.com and get started with it right away. The last thing I want to do before we get started is to install Node.js. Node is basically a server environment that allows you to actually run JavaScript code on your computer. Without it, we wouldn't be able to actually run our code and see what it is doing. So go to nodejs.org and install the version that is recommended for most users. When you do this, it should automatically install another package, Node Package Manager, or NPM, that we will need as well. Now that you have those 2 things installed, let's actually create our React app. React comes with a creation tool called Create React App, or CRA, but it's rather slow and manages packages pretty inefficiently. For our sake, we're going to use a tool called Vite that will create our React app for us and give us lightning fast startup times when we want to launch our code. So to do this, open up your Visual Studio Code and go ahead and open up your terminal in the bottom. To do this, if it's not open by default, you can go to View at the top here and then look down here and click Terminal. So once the terminal is open at the bottom here, you have a couple of options like Problems, Output, Debug Console, and Terminal, but make sure you just have this terminal selected. Next, you're going to want to go into the directory that you want to use. So as you can see, my root directory here as shown by my terminal is users/Austin, which are both folders on my computer. So most of the code that I have in my PC is stored in a repos folder, which is inside a source folder, which is inside this Austin folder that we have here. So to get to that directory, all I need to do is type cd, which means change directory, and then the name of the directory. So I'll type cd source and then press enter to run it. And now you can see the terminal is in the source folder. Next, I will type cd repos, press enter to run it, and now we're in the repos folder. So these correspond to actual folders on your computer, so I'd suggest making a folder where you want to keep all of your React code, and then run this cd command to make your terminal look at that folder. If you need help using the cd function to get into the folder that you want, do a quick search online, you should find plenty of answers. Once you're in the folder that you want within this terminal, now we can actually create our React app. So in this terminal, go ahead and just type npm create, and then type vite at latest like this. So this just uses the npm package we installed with Node and calls its create function to create a Vite program. If you type at latest after Vite, it'll just install the latest version of Vite within your program. Once you have this type, go ahead and press enter. And then it's going to ask if you want to install this create Vite package, so type Y to confirm this, and then press enter again. And then after this, it'll just ask for a name, which we will just call it React app like this for now. So we'll go ahead and press enter there after we made our name React app. And then it's going to ask what framework we want to use. Of course, this is a React course, so use your arrow keys here to navigate down to React here, which should be highlighted in blue, and then just click enter. And then next, it'll ask what language variant we want. For this course, we're just going to be using plain JavaScript, so just go down to JavaScript here, and then go ahead and press enter. So after this, your project is now created, and it gives us a few instructions to just finish the process. Because it just made a new folder with whatever name you entered in, we want to change our terminal to look at that folder. So we need a cd into that folder. So in my case, I'll just type cd react app because we named it React app, and then I'll press enter. And now we're in our React app folder and can interact with it how we please. And next, all we need to do is run npm install as per our instructions, which will look at our program and install any dependencies or packages that need to be installed. So I'll go ahead and press enter there. And then once that is all done running, all we need to do to actually launch our app is just type npm run dev, again as per the instructions, and then just press enter. And what this does is generates a local host link that we can use to actually see our local website that we are building. So if you hold down Control and click it, it should open up a site and it should look something like this. And this is our actual app that we have just created. From now on, we're going to have our code editor on one side of the screen and our app on the other side of the screen. That way we can always see how our code is affecting our site. The great thing about using Vite with React is that the site will always update in real time without having to actually restart it. Now, our project is fully set up and ready to go. This is the base site that appears when creating a React app with Vite. Now that we have our site actually set up and ready to go, let's look at our coding environment a bit and see what our React project has set up for us. In VS Code, go to the File Explorer tab, which should be these two pages in the top left here. Go ahead and click them, and then it'll say you have not opened a folder yet. So click this Open Folder link here, and then navigate to whichever folder you made. Once you have it selected, it'll fill the folder contents with your Explorer here if you just click Select Folder like this. So it'll reload, it'll probably ask you if you trust the authors here. We'll just say yes, I trust the authors, and then your directory should look something like this. Let me quickly go through each of these folders so I can explain what each one of them means. So if we look at this top folder here called Node Modules and open it, you'll see we get a huge folder filled with a bunch of other folders. So whenever we run npm install, it installs all the libraries and packages we need into this Node Modules folder, so it's going to have a lot of content in it. We don't need to worry too much about this folder for now though. Next, we've got this public folder, which typically just holds SVG icons and other small items. Then we've got our src or source folder, which is where all of our web page code is actually stored. I'll open it up in just a second so we can see what's in there. These ESLint and getignore files we don't need to worry about too much as of right now. Package.json and package.lock.json both hold information for your installed dependencies using npm, which are both important files we'll need to be using in the future. And then we have this Vite config file here, and it just has some setup data for our Vite environment. So next, let's look at our src or our source folder and see how it interacts with this index.html file that we have here. This assets folder that we have within source just has another SVG icon for our React logo, which we don't care about. App.css and index.css are going to be our CSS files which describe how we're formatting our content. We don't need to worry about too much CSS right now because it's not important to our React code, just the site formatting. We'll talk about CSS stuff a little bit later. The main files we're concerned about are app.jsx and main.jsx. So normally .js is the file extension for JavaScript, but .jsx is the typical file extension for React files. .js files will still run React just fine, but I get used to using the .jsx extension. If we go into main.jsx, here's what it looks like. The goal of this main.jsx file is to be the entry point of all of our React code. Within this folder, we're accessing the React DOM and then using it to call render, which will actually generate our React site. So if you look up top here at the imports, you can see that we're importing our app.jsx file. And then within our render function down here, we're accessing this app using this notation, which basically sets up app.jsx as our main React file. So the purpose of this main.jsx is to actually render our React code and give it a main page to render, which in our case is app.jsx as specified by this app here. So now if we go to our index.html file and we look at the bottom of this HTML content and see where it says body here and look at this, and then we see where it says script here, notice how we have this argument right here, src, and it's passing in our main.jsx file. So what exactly is this doing? Well, this is basically injecting the main.jsx file directly into our HTML. Then, as we just saw, once this main.jsx is injected, it will call React's render function to render our actual app content, which is in here, which just renders our actual app like this, which is represented by our app.jsx file. So now let's actually go to app.jsx and see what's going on here. So here's what app.jsx looks like. Many React files will look just like this one, but I'll get more into that in the next episode in terms of the file format for React. What we need to know for right now is that if we go to our web page here, every single thing on this page comes from our app.jsx file that we have here open on the right, since our web app is only a one-page application right now. So for example, if we scroll down, we can see what we have looks like HTML in this file by these tags here. Let's just go ahead and change this line here. So instead of saying v plus React, we're just going to instead say something like, welcome to my React project. And then now if we save this file, which I just use Control S for, and now look at our page, you can see that it now shows, welcome to my React project. So as long as you save your files in Visual Studio Code, your React site will automatically update for you. So that's going to wrap it up for this first episode. In this episode, you learned what React is, how to create and set up a React environment, and you learned a little bit about what the React environment looks like. In the very next episode, we'll actually explore React files and their format so you can begin to understand what all of this code here means. I'll see you in the next video. Hey everyone, and welcome back to the React for Beginners series. In this episode, we're going to go over the general structure of React code, which is mainly centered around the idea of components. We'll also talk about JSX, which is a huge part of React code. To get started, let's make sure we've loaded up the project we created in the last episode. If you need to relaunch the site, just run npm run dev in your terminal, just like we did in the last episode. Let's start by taking a look at our app.jsx file and dissect it to get a better idea of what's going on. So in our app.jsx file, if we look at the top here, we can see we have all of our imports. So at the top of every React file, we need to import all the items we're going to be using within that file. In our case, we've got a useState function from React, the two logos for both React and V, and then the app CSS file. The reason imports are important is because when we have a React project like this, we're going to have multiple folders with their own files and maybe even folders within folders. The idea of importing is that we can grab exports from certain files by importing them into another file. If we want to use functions from another library, like React, we're going to be using this format that we have for the useState import, like this. useState is a function from React that's super important to know, but we're not going to dive into it just yet. Now let's look at the actual core of this app.jsx file. You'll see we have a function called app here. And if we follow these squiggly brackets all the way down, you can see this app function that we have encompasses this entire code chunk all the way up to before this export default app at the bottom. This export default app here is just telling our code to export the app so that it can be referenced in other files via an import, which is how we imported our app file into main.jsx. But if we go back up to our function and look at all of this stuff, what actually is this stuff up here? Well, let me explain. So the core of React is the concept of components, which are just blocks of code that represent some aspect of functionality. So what do I mean by this? Well, every function in React is called a component. So in our case, we have a component here that is called app. Each component will generally always be broken into two chunks of code within the function. You have the actual code inside the function, as you would with any other function in any other programming language, and then you have the return value. The code you see at the top of the component is just straight up JavaScript. In our case, we have this const count setCount equals useState 0, which I will get into detail about in a future episode. But this line here is just JavaScript code. And then we have our actual return value down here within this return statement. If we look carefully, we can see that this return value is actually returning this entire block of code that looks almost just like HTML. So what's this all about? Well, this is probably the most important part of React here, and this is what we call JSX, which stands for JavaScript XML, and it's almost identical to HTML with a few differences. JSX has many of the same tags that HTML has, for instance div, an A for link, img for an image, button for a button, and so forth. I'll go over these differences in just a moment. To have a function be a valid React component, it must return some JSX code. So if you go up here, notice that our return function encompasses every single chunk of the JSX that we have. All of this JSX code here is what our component is going to output. So let's look at our page to show you what I mean. If we look at our React page that we have here on the left-hand side, let's see what our JSX says versus what it actually shows on the page. So if we look at our return statement here within our React app component, we can see first that we have an empty div-like tab at the top here, like this, that also closes down here at the bottom. So React always needs to return a single div or a single element, so many times you may see an empty div tag surrounding all JSX in a function return. Then what do we have? So we have a div tag here that is comprised of two A tags, which just stands for link, just like HTML, and within each link we have an image using img, just like HTML does as well. The image source for each is just the Vite logo and the React logo that we actually imported from up top here. And those are just the two logos you see here on the left-hand side, the one on the left being Vite and the one on the right being React. And then we have some more text like a heading tag that just says, welcome to my React project. A P tag down here that just says we can edit the app.jsx. And then we got, for instance, another P tag down here telling us to click on the logos to just learn more. So this entire page that we're seeing here on the left-hand side all comes from this return value of our app component. So we have what looks like a somewhat normal JavaScript component here, how we define function app. However, when we return JSX is what makes this an actual React component. Just so you can get a better idea of how all this works, let's actually make our own component. So let's go into our File Explorer menu here in Visual Studio Code, right-click on this source folder here, and then go ahead and click New File. And then we can make a new file. I'm just going to name it button.jsx like this. If we had .js instead of .jsx, it would still actually work. However, it's good practice to use JSX instead of JS since that's more formally correct. If we go ahead and press enter here, it'll create a new file for us. Inside this button, let's define a function. So we'll say function button like this, and then we'll add our curly brackets. So it's standard practice in React to capitalize the first letter of each component. And React will actually throw you a warning if you don't capitalize the first letter. So I'm going to want to export this function to be used on other pages. So before this function word here, I'm just going to type export. So we have export function button. If we wanted to add some JavaScript functionality, we could add some JavaScript code within our function. But for now, let's just focus on the return value or the JSX. So I'm just going to go ahead in this function. I'm going to write return like this. And then to make this a valid React component, we'll want to return some JSX. Inside this return statement here, let's just make a button tag like this. So I'll write button as that, and it'll autofill the ending tag. And then let's make a space here just to make some more room here. Let's add a paragraph tag with P, and then same thing, if we write the opening tag, it should autofill the closing tag. So inside of this P, let's just write something, let's say testing. Now, how do we actually use this component now that we've made a little something here? So we've already stated that we want to export this button. So now let's actually go back into our app.jsx file. And at the top, let's just go ahead and go up here, make room right here. I'm going to write import, and I'm going to start typing button. And then it should autofill here because it knows that we made a component named button now because it's in our directory. And so if I press enter, it just automatically fills in the import line for us. So by writing this line here, we have effectively imported this button component that we just made a moment ago. So how do we render a component now? So let's actually scroll to the bottom of our JSX in our return statement here. And I'm going to make a space below this last P tag. And then to render a component that we've imported, all we need to do is simply type it like we would in any other JSX tag. So what I mean by that is if we wanted to render the button component, all we need to type is button like this. And you want to make sure we have a closing slash, like something like this, and it should highlight gold as so. One thing you want to make sure of is that the text here matches exactly how it was imported as. So we imported it as this with the capital B and the rest of the letters lowercase. So when we're rendering it, we want to make sure that it is typed exactly the same in this format. So now if we go ahead and save this file using Control S and then save this file here, we now have a button that says testing on our page. So all we've really done is just made a standalone button component, imported it into our app file like this, and then we just render that component using the notation that looks something like this. What's cool about React components is that once you make them, they can be used anywhere and as much as you want. So let's say I want to actually render 3 buttons now. I could just type this same thing 3 times. So I'm just going to take this, I'm just going to copy it, and I'm going to paste it twice like this. And then if we go ahead and Control S and save this page, we now have 3 of the button components that we've just made. Now I mentioned earlier that our app.jsx file actually is a component too because we're writing it as a function and we are returning JSX. If we go to our main.jsx file, notice that we are actually rendering our app component with the exact same notation that we are rendering our button component with. This notation is the universal notation for rendering components in, and at least in VS Code, it'll always be highlighted yellow if you're doing it properly. Now let's add some JavaScript code to our button component so you can see the real power of React. Of course, it's nice having just JSX in our component to be reused, but alone that's not what makes React good. What makes React good is that we can have functionality within each component in addition to having the JSX. Any JavaScript code that we have inside of our function component should be within the function but outside the return statement, meaning it'll come before the return statement does. Just like any other programming language, we can't have any actual code in a function after the return statement. So let's go ahead and make some space up here inside of our function, but before our return statement. And then let's just make a variable. I'm going to say let number equals 7. I'll make sure it's actually indented here so it looks a little more organized. And then if we wanted to actually use our JavaScript code inside of our JSX, all we need to do inside one of these tags here would just be to use curly brackets and then type in the name of our variable, which is just number. So if I did that, it would look something like this. I would use curly brackets and then I would just type in number like this. And now if I were to save this, you can see that in all of our buttons now, we have the number 7. So a very important rule of thumb is that anytime you ever want to put JavaScript code inside of your JSX, all you need to do is use curly brackets, and then the code will know you're about to put in JavaScript and not just some text. Because if we did it without the curly brackets like this, it would just interpret that as the actual word number. So we got to specify the curly brackets, and then it'll know that we're talking about actual JavaScript code. Anytime I change this variable now and save it, those changes will be reflected on our web page. Because React is powered by JavaScript, I could have all sorts of JavaScript in each component here. So, for instance, if I were to just change a 7 to a 4 and saved it, now all these buttons show 4 and so on. So you can kind of just mess around with it as you need, and JavaScript can easily be injected into JSX. As another example using JavaScript to power JSX, let's say I just made a new variable. I'm going to say let display string like this, and then I'm going to say an if statement. I'm going to write if number greater than 10, we're going to, let's say, display string equals big number. And then we're just going to say else, and then we're going to say display string equals small number. And then inside of our JSX, instead of plugging in number, let's plug in display string like this. And then let's make sure we save this file. And you can now see that it displays small number in each of these buttons. Why? Well, number is equal to 7 up here, and 7 is less than 10. Therefore, display string gets set to small number. If I were to change this number to 15, for instance, now our components would change and they would instead say big number. The idea here that we're building upon is that we can have all sorts of JavaScript functionality here that we can easily just plug into our JSX to display whatever functionality is being done. One thing that makes React very flexible is that you can have components within components within components, basically infinitely. So for example, let's make a new file in our source folder. And I'm just going to call it, let's say, button section.jsx like this, and then press enter and make this new file. And so inside of it, we'll make a new component that we can export. So we'll say export function, let's say button section like this, and then obviously use our curly brackets. And then at the top here, let's import the button component we've already made. So I'm going to type import button, and it should be able to autofill it like this. And then, like always with any React component, we need to have a return statement that returns JSX. So I'm going to write return. And then for now, just so we can have like a singular parent tag, I'm going to do empty tag. Oops. I'm going to do an empty tag like this. Should autofill it, and we'll just make some space like this, just so we have a return statement now with actual JSX inside of it. Now, let's say all we want to do with this button section component is put 3 buttons inside of it, so we don't have to explicitly display 3 buttons in our app.jsx file. So to do this, we could literally just go in here and render a button like we would any other component. And let's just copy and paste this. So we have 3 individual buttons here. So this component is basically just a larger component that has 3 smaller components inside of it. Now let's go into our app.jsx file. Let's go up to the top here, and then let's go ahead and import the button section component. And it should be able to autofill there. We can press enter, and it'll autofill just like that. And then instead of at the bottom rendering these 3 buttons individually, we can just render one whole button section, which will end up being the exact same thing since button section just has 3 buttons inside of it. So to do that, just like we rendered button, I could render button section as a component like this. And then of course, if we saved our file, we now have a button section component instead of 3 buttons, but again, it looks identical. If I wanted to clone this section, I could of course just copy and paste it a few times like this. I could just copy it and paste it like that. And then if I were to save it, I would have 9 total buttons since our button section has 3 in each one and we're rendering 3 of them. So 3 times 3 is 9. For now, we'll just go ahead and delete this extra 2 though, so it doesn't look so ugly. Before we end this video, let me just quickly go over a few key differences between HTML and JSX. Like I mentioned earlier, JSX is just React's version of HTML, so they're almost identical in a lot of ways. One of the most obvious differences between the two is that in HTML, when you're calling CSS properties, you normally pass in a class tag. In JSX, however, we call this class name, like for instance in this div here. So in our app.jsx file, any reference to CSS uses class name, with the C being lowercase and the N being capitalized. Aside from that, nearly all tags in JSX are almost identical to all tags in HTML, except React uses camel case for everything and doesn't use any sort of hyphens or extra characters. So for example, in HTML to use onClick, you would just write onClick in all lowercase, but in React, the C in click is capitalized. Another example would be background color. In HTML, background color is background hyphen color, but in React, it is background color with the B being lowercase and the C being capitalized as kind of one string of words together. Basically, anytime you see any HTML property and you want to use it in JSX, remove all extra spaces or hyphens or underscores, and then apply camel case to the words, meaning the first word starts with lowercase, but every word after that starts with uppercase. If you do that, then it should properly be converted from HTML to JSX. If you need extra help using JSX or converting HTML to JSX, check out the JSX documentation on the React website for specific details. And that about wraps up this video. In this video, you learned what a React component is, and the general structure of components and their interaction with React's version of HTML, which we just call JSX. In the next video, we'll look at expanding the scope of our components by adding in props. I'll see you in the next one. Hey everyone, and welcome back to the React for Beginners series. In the last episode, we went over React components and the idea of JSX within each component. In this episode, we're going to go over passing props into our components, which will allow us to add all sorts of customization to our components and make them more dynamic. After last episode, we left off with a button section component that just encompasses 3 button components here, and then all we did is render this button section component within our app.jsx file. Right now, our button components are all identical, which doesn't make them extremely useful if we want to do any sort of customization. As you can see on the page here on the left, we have 3 numbers that all just say big number. So how can we customize each component so that each one is still a button, but has its own properties? That's where props come in. For now, let's just get rid of our button section component and just render in a button instead, individually. And then on top of that, I just want to go ahead and delete all this extra stuff here that we got when we first created our app. So I'm just going to go up here, highlight all this from the div all the way to this last p tag, and just backspace and delete it so that we just have the component button that we made. And then we'll go ahead and save this page here. So we now just have one button on the page. And then let's go ahead and go into our button.jsx file. In normal JavaScript, these parentheses here next to the function name would specify where we could enter in our function arguments. In React, we don't use function arguments traditionally. Rather, we use them as what we call props to style our components. One of the common ways to do this is to literally just write props inside of our argument parentheses. So we're going to do just that and write it like this as props. So this props argument that we just made will represent an object. Anytime we want to access specific properties from our prop argument, all we need to do is type prop and then the dot operator and then whatever our property name was. For example, let's say this component has 2 properties, text and color. To access our text property, we could do something like props.text, and then to access color, we could do something like props.color like that. So now you're probably wondering how we actually give our components properties, and let me show you that. So to give your component specific properties, you have to give those properties when you render in your component. So if we go to our app.jsx file, we're rendering in our button component right here at this line. If we wanted to pass in a text and color argument, we could do it here in this render here. So let's first pass in a text argument. So to do that, within our actual tag here, let's write text equals, I'm just going to say sample text like this. So anytime we want to pass in a property, we need to write the name of the property we want, which we just called text, and then an equal sign, and then we need to specify curly brackets, and then inside of the curly brackets, we can pass in whatever we want our text argument to be. Next, let's add a color argument in the same way that we added a text argument. So we're going to just make a space here. We're going to say color, and then we're going to say equals curly brackets, and then inside we're going to pass a string, and for that we're just going to say red. So this is the same idea. The property name we want is color, then we do an equal sign, then curly brackets, and then put whatever color we want inside the curly brackets. So now that we've specified our arguments in our actual component render, let's go back to our component file itself to access them. So we'll go ahead and navigate to our button.jsx file. And I said a moment ago that to access text, we would need to do props.text, for instance, if we have a text prop. And to do color, we would just need to do props.color like this. So now one thing we want to do to make sure of is that we're writing props.text, for instance, to access the text property. It matches the spelling and capitalization exactly how we specified it in the component render. So we're accessing text here. We want to make sure that in app.jsx, where we're rendering it, that we're making it the exact same word, so it's text with all lowercase letters. If I were to, for instance, not make it match exactly, and I did, let's say, text with a capital T like that, it wouldn't work because they're not spelled exactly the same. So just make sure that it matches in the component render, and that it also matches within the actual component that you're using it in, like this. Let's go ahead and just delete all this extra fluff here that we made last episode, and let's actually put our props into action so you can see how they work. Inside of our p tag, instead of displaying this display string, let's go ahead and just delete this. And let's instead show our text property. So to do that, we still need to use curly brackets, and then all we need to do is type props.text like this. And then if we go ahead and save this file now, and then we also save our app.jsx file, you'll see that our website now updates, and notice how our button's text now reflects the property that we passed into it in app.jsx, which is just sample text. So all that our button component is effectively doing is just displaying whatever text property is passed into it as a property. So if I wanted to modify it, I could just go into app.jsx where we're actually rendering it, and I could just change this text argument here, and we could reflect it to anything that we wanted. So I could, for instance, say hi YouTube like this, and then I could go ahead and save the file, and you see that the button now updates to saying hi YouTube. Now our component is dynamic and not static because we can pass in whatever text we want when we call it to render. We also passed in this color argument here, so let's actually now implement that argument. So let's go into our button.jsx file, and then to access it, we're actually going to make some of our own inline CSS here. So to do inline CSS in JSX, all you need to do is make a style property in any tag you want to put the CSS in. So for instance, I'm going to go into our button tag, I'm going to make a style property like this, and then an equal sign, and then we need to write double curly brackets for any CSS that we want to do. And then with this, we can specify any properties that we want as key value pairs like we would in any other object. So if I want to have a background color property, I could type background color, as this is how we would type it in JSX. And then I could do colon to show we're doing a key value pair. And then now we want to access the color property that we passed in when rendering our component. So on the other side of this colon, I'm just going to write props.color like this. And then if I go ahead and save this file here, we've now turned our button red. So we've now accessed both the text property and the color property. Before we go on, let me just quickly review what we've done so far. We passed a props argument into our function by just writing props inside of our function argument here. Then inside of our app.jsx file, where we actually render this component in, we've passed in two properties. We have text and then we have color. For text, we just wrote hi YouTube, and for the color, we just passed in red. And then if we look back at our component file, which is just button.jsx, we've accessed those properties we passed in by just typing props.text to access the text, and then typing props.color to access the color using a little bit of CSS inline styling here. Now here's the neat thing about props. Now that we've passed in these props inside of our actual component file, we can make as many button components as we want and customize them each individually. So for example, let's go back into our app.jsx file, and let's go ahead and take this button line here. I'm just going to copy it, and then I'm just going to paste it twice. Actually, scratch that. I'm just going to paste it once in here just so we have two buttons. And then, let's see. We want to pass in just some text to our second button here. Let's just say something like, I'm button 2. And then for the color argument, let's just pass another color. Let's just say purple like this. And then let's go ahead and save this file here. And now we have 2 buttons, each with their own unique text and color. So basically, the idea with passing in props is that it gives us the ability to customize our components however we want. Because in our button.jsx file, I put props.text inside of our text here, and then style the background color with props.color, this allows us to specify these properties when we render it in app.jsx by just passing in the properties when we render it here. Of course, we could always add more props if we wanted to. So what happens if we render a button component but don't specify the props that we need for it? So if we actually just go in this file here that we have, let's just copy this here. Just copy one of these lines and then paste it. And then we're going to take away the props just so it is pretty much just an empty button component. And then if we go ahead and save this here, it looks like right here we just have a completely empty button component. Because our component now relies on having both a text and color prop, we want to make sure we're passing in both of these properties, or else our component will have things missing from it, in our case, both the text and the color. So to fix this, we can just pass in more props. Let's just say text equals, and then for the text here, let's just say testing. And then let's pass in a color. And then for our color, let's just say green. And then save it. And now we have yet another button in our code. The point I'm trying to make with this example is that if you're going to give a component props like we do in button.jsx, we want to make sure we're passing in all those possible props wherever we render it in another component. Because if we don't, we're going to be missing aspects of our component code. One of the interesting things about props is that you can also pass in functions as props instead of just data types like strings or numbers. To show you what I mean by this, let's actually make a function inside of our app.jsx. And yes, if you're curious, you can have functions inside this app function. The functions can be React components and return JSX, or they could just be normal JavaScript functions. For now, we're just going to write a basic JavaScript function though. So to write this function, first I'm just going to delete this useState line up here that we had from our initial code, just so we can get rid of it. And then I'm going to write a function side of our code. I'm just going to say function, let's just call it notify. We'll do our curly brackets to signify the writing a function. And then I'm going to add a message argument in here. That will be our notification. Inside this function, all we want to do is just type alerts message like this. So basically, whenever we call this function, we just pass in a message to alert the user with, and that's all this function does. And then let's actually pass in this function that we have as a prop to our buttons. So inside of this first button here, I'm going to add a prop here. I'm going to call it func just for function. And we're just going to pass in the notify function that we just created. And then I'm going to make another prop. I'm just going to call it msg for message. And then I'm just going to set it equal to button one message like this. Now that we've passed in a prop called func and also a prop called message or msg, now if we go inside of our button.jsx file, we can now access those using props.func and props.msg. So I'm actually going to make an onClick event here that'll help us call our function. So I'm going to have a whole episode to handling events, so I won't get super deep into it now. But for now, inside of this button here, we're just going to write an onClick property. I'm going to write onClick, type it, equals, we'll do curly brackets here, and then we're going to write it like this. Say parentheses arrow props.func, and then we're going to pass in props.msg like this. Whenever we call this onClick property here, we need to pass in a function into our curly brackets here. So we are just passing in the function property that we pass in as props, and then that is equal to notify, because if you notice here, props.func, we passed in notify here. So inside this button component, props.func is equal to notify. And then inside of this, we're just passing in the message argument that we're also passing inside of our app. So props.message, which is equal to button1message because we pass it in here as a prop. If we make sure this file is saved and app.jsx is saved, and we now click on this first button, you'll see that it now pops up with an alert that just says button1 message inside of it. So we gave button1 a func property and a message property with these two right here. And then now we're just using this onClick event to actually trigger that function within that argument. Let's say we want to do a similar thing with button2. We could do the same thing. So button2, let's pass in a func and message argument as well. So I'm just going to write func and then message like this. And then we're going to pass in the same notify function. But instead of passing in button1 message for this, for the message prop, let's just pass in button2 message. We'll say button2 message just like that. Now, if we were to try and click button 2, you'll see it pops up with an alert at the top of the screen that says button 2 message. And then, of course, if we could do button 1 again, and it would say button 1 message, And these are different because of the way that we're passing in props, because obviously this one has a message of button 1 message, and this is our first button. And then this one has a message of button 2 message, and this is our second button. So in addition to just passing in things like strings or numbers as props, you should now see how we can pass in functions as well. And I'm going to be honest, I don't use functions as props very much in my React code, mainly because you typically want to have components have functionality independent of each other, while passing in a function in one component like app.jsx to another subcomponent like button sort of makes their functionality sort of joint in a way. I will say though, when dealing with state, which we'll learn about in a future episode, there are some potentially interesting use cases for passing in functions as props to a component. One last thing I want to go over with props is the idea of props destructuring. So destructuring is something that is very useful that I actually use quite a bit, and you may see other people use it a lot as well. Basically, instead of having one giant props object here, you can specify the actual props that you want more specifically. Here's how we can do that. So to destructure the props of a component, instead of just writing props in the component arguments here, we can instead replace this with just curly brackets like this, and then list out each prop individually separated by commas. So we have 4 props that we have passing right now. We have text, and we'll say comma color, comma func, and then message like this. And again, we want to make sure we use curly brackets here so the component doesn't get confused. Then if we do it this way, we can just remove any reference to our massive props object. So basically everywhere it says props, we'll just delete that and get the name of the actual props. Right here on props.text, we can just delete that so it just says text. We'll make sure this just calls func, and then this just calls MSG, and then this just here calls color. Like that. And then if we were to go ahead and save this page, nothing actually changes because it is actually the exact same functionality, but you can see our page works in the exact same way. In my opinion now, I think the code looks a little bit cleaner. So basically, by default, if you pass in a props argument into the parentheses here, it makes one huge object that holds every property inside that object, hence why we use the word props. And then the property name. But when we use curly brackets and write out the properties like this, in this way, we're destructuring that props object, which just means breaking it into its individual properties, removing the need for any reference to an actual props object. So I'm a big fan of props destruction because I don't like having to type props every time I want to access a property before every property. But it's honestly just up to personal preference on what you want to do. Doing props the original way or doing props with destructuring both yield the same results, and there's no real right answer. So pick whatever way feels better to you. And with that, that pretty much wraps up this video for props. In this video, you learn how to pass props into components, which includes passing them in when we render them, as well as specifying them in our actual component file. You'll also learn how to pass in functions as props, as well as destructuring props as an alternative way of dealing with a props object. In the next video, we'll go over the idea of state, which is an incredibly important topic, and one of the core features of React. I will see you in the next one. Hey everyone, and welcome back to the React for Beginners series. In the last episode, we went over passing props to our components, which allowed us to customize our components as we call them. In this episode, we're going to look at one of the core features of React, which is the concept of state. So what exactly is state? Imagine a scenario. Imagine we have a button on a page that needs to record the number of times it is clicked by a user. Let's assume this button is a React component. When the page is launched, the button should say 0, and then when clicked once, it'll go to 1, then clicked again, it'll go to 2, and so forth. We can't do this easily with props because this button needs to be storing real-time changing data. So how do we do this? This is where state comes in. State in React is basically the concept of properties and data that can change and adapt within a component. Every React component has its own state, which is completely independent of the state of other components. When the state of a component changes, the component will automatically re-render itself to show the updated state. In our button example, here's how this works. Our button is a React component that has its own state. Somewhere in our state, we can have a count variable. Every time the user clicks the button, the count variable is incremented, and then the button re-renders itself. Because we have a count variable in our state, every time it changes, the button will automatically update itself. The concept of automatic re-rendering of components is a very important feature of React, so much so that it's why React is called React in the first place. React components can react to actions done on a page because of state. State is what makes React very dynamic and, well, reactive. So on paper, the idea of a button holding a counting state is a simple way to show the concept of state. However, in practice, a button holding a count isn't something you're probably going to be using in an actual app. So what are some common applications of state in React? Imagine you have a nav bar that has a drop-down menu for your profile and settings. To flip a drop-down on and off, we could have a Boolean state that would change each time the drop-down is clicked. The first time it is clicked, the state is set to true, so the drop-down shows. Then it is clicked again and goes back to false, so the drop-down goes away, and so forth. Or imagine you have a list of tasks to do on your web app. You want to be able to add and remove tasks as well as marking them as completed. On our page, we could have an array in our state that holds these tasks. Each time we want to add a new task, we append a task string to our array state, or each time we want to remove a task, we could remove an entry from our array state. And when each of these actions is taken, our page will automatically re-render to show the updated task list. The potential use cases of React State are pretty widespread, so without wasting any time, let's look at how we can actually implement React State in our code. We left off having 3 buttons on our main app page, where within each button we have some customizable props. For now, let's just remove all these props except for color. So I'm actually going to remove 2 of the buttons too. I'm going to take 2 of these buttons away. Let's remove this function and message prop. We'll go ahead and delete this function here. And then let's also modify in our button.jsx as well. So let's just get rid of the function and message for now. And then, which means we will get rid of this onClick event, just like that. So our component is back to the way we had it originally. And actually, I'm going to also take away this text argument here and make sure I take it away in button.jsx as well, because we're wanting to do a scenario. Let's just say we want to do the scenario that we went over. We have a button that will show how many times it has been clicked. It's pretty simple to do this, so let me just show you. The first thing I want to do is import the primary React function used to declare state, and that's a function called useState. So to import it up here at the top of our code, or this component, we'll just type import useState, and it should autofill here this useState, and we can just press enter and it'll import it from the React library as such. Then to actually use this function and declare some state in our component, all we need to do is this. So I'll make some space here, and let's make sure we're down in our component function, but not the return statement because that's our JSX. So we have this space up here in our function body where we'll actually make our state. So to use this useState function, we need to use this syntax. So I'll write it and then I'll explain it in just a moment. So I'm going to write const, I'm going to say count, set count, and then say equals useState 0 as this. So what does this line here actually mean? So const is the standard for declaring React State variables. And then inside the square brackets here, we're getting 2 variables, which we can name whatever we want. In our case, we have count and set count. The first variable here is always the actual state variable that we're declaring. And then the second is always the function that we'll use to set our state variable. We usually always call these functions the setter functions because they set our state. It's standard practice to name the setter function name to be equal to set, and then whatever the name of the state variable is. So in our case, if we declare a variable called count, we should make the setter function set count. If we had a state variable called, let's say, filter, for instance, we should make this function set filter. You're not going to get any errors if you don't follow this, but this is standard practice as it makes the code a bit more understandable. And then all we're doing is setting this equal to the useState function we just imported from React. The value we put in the useState parentheses here, right here, in our case 0, will always be the value that the state is initialized with. So in our case, the state is being initialized with the value 0. If you're new to JavaScript, this line probably looks a little bit confusing because the syntax isn't super obvious. Basically, we're doing something called array destructuring. When we call this useState function here, it's actually returning an array of variables, where the first is the state variable and the second is the state function. By doing this notation here with const and then we're doing count and set count, all we're doing is accessing and naming these variables, basically just doing a multiple variable declaration. If that still doesn't make a ton of sense, don't worry, because as long as you know how to write state declarations like this, that's all you really need to know. Now what do we do once we've created our state variable and function? Now let's look at our JSX. And because we removed the message prop, let's now instead fill our p field with our state count variable. So I'm just going to fill this instead of saying text, we'll just fill it with count here. And I'm going to go ahead and save this. And now if we look at our page here and look at our button, we have the value 0 inside of the button here. That's because we specified 0 as the starting value when we called this useState function. But now we need to do something to the button whenever it is clicked. In our last episode, we made an onClick event that we used to show our function, or the notify function that we had. So let's actually do the same thing in this one. Let's make an onClick event and then use that to modify our state. So to do that, just like last time, we will type onClick here and make sure we have equals and then curly brackets, and we'll just space it out. So separate from there. And now we have an onClick tag that we can plug in whatever function we want. And this is where our state function will actually come in, or our setter function. Every time the button is clicked, we want to call the state function to set our state to a new value. So inside this onClick, we want to do something like this. We're going to do an arrow function like this. So empty, we'll say empty parentheses for now, arrow, and then we're going to call our setter function we just made set count, and we're going to count in, or we're going to pass in count plus 1 like this. Anytime that we use a setter function like setCount, the argument that we pass into our function will become the new value of the state. So in our case, we want to look at the existing count and then just add 1 to it, hence why we're doing count plus 1. So whenever this button is clicked, we're accessing our setCount function and passing it our current count plus 1, which basically just increments it by 1. If we go ahead and save this app now, and then we look at our page, let's test it out. So the button starts at 0, and then we click it, and it goes to 1, and then we click it, it goes to 2 again, and every time we click it now, it is incrementing the count by 1. So we now have a working button clicking component. Let's go back to our button component real quick so I can clarify a few things. One thing you may be wondering is, why do we need a function to change our count variable? Couldn't we just, inside this onClick, just write something like, let's just say, count plus 1 like that? Well, you could, but it wouldn't actually do anything. If I went ahead and just save this page now, you see our button's at 17 because that's what it was at before, but now if I click it, and I'm clicking it over and over again, nothing actually happens. So the point of React having setter functions is to let the page know that the state is being updated. The setter function is what triggers the re-render of the app, and is what updates your component. Without it, if you were to just try and modify the state directly, like this, we're just doing count plus 1, nothing is going to happen. So long story short, anytime you're going to update any state at all, you need to use the setter function and just pass in whatever you want the new value of your state to be. Without it, it will not work correctly. So I'm just going to go ahead and Control Z this and then turn it back to normal and then go ahead and save. And now our button is working properly once again. What's neat about using state is that any time that we now want to render in a button component, each single button that we render in will have its own state. So for example, let's go into app here. Let's actually render in a few more buttons. So I'm going to copy this. I'm going to paste it twice. And let's just change the colors here. Let's put this one as green. Let's put this one as purple. And then we're going to go ahead and save it like this. I'm going to refresh the page so it's not on 34 anymore. And then now if we try to click any of these buttons, notice that they all don't update. Because we've made state inside of our component, the state is actually unique to every single component that we render. So 15 is unique to this button, 0 is unique to this button, and now it would be updated if I clicked it. And basically each button would have its own unique state counting variable. Another one of the great things about React is that we can store as many pieces of state as we want. So maybe we had some piece of state we needed in our app that holds a filter for our component. So to make a filter piece of state, we could just add to our counts that appear. We can make another line, let's just say like const filter, set filter like this, and then say use state, and then want to initialize its value to, let's just say, none. So by default, we're setting this filter state to be equal to the string none. Then if we wanted to display this filter state, we could just write filter wherever we needed it. And then if we wanted to update it, we could just use our setFilter setter function to change the filter to another string. Because we're not actually going to be using a filter piece of state, I'm going to delete this for now, but just know that we could have as many pieces of state as we want. So we could literally have like 100 of these use states inside of one of our components. And in fact, many React components and programs you may look at will have multiple pieces of state in each component. Because React is all about reactivity, it's common to see multiple pieces of state inside of a component that may interact with each other. Before we look at more complex examples involving multiple pieces of state, let's look at another simple example where state could be implemented. For our next example, let's imagine we have a text box where we can type some words. As we type the words, our state will be updated and posted in a paragraph tag below the text box. So to do this, let's go ahead and look at our file explorer here. Let's go into our source folder, and let's make a new file. Let's just call it, we'll say textbox.jsx. And then inside this, we'll write a standard React component function as export function textbox like this. And then we'll go ahead and just specify a return statement where we will just say like an empty tag like this. First things first, let's import useState from React just like we did with our button component. So I'm going to write import useState, and then it'll autofill like this. So now we've imported our useState function. And then let's actually go into our component here, and let's make a function to actually make a piece of state here. So we'll do const, and then we're going to name our piece of state text, and our setter function will just be setText. And then for now, we just want to set the text to be defaulted to, let's just say, an empty string. So basically, again, all this line is doing is we're accessing React's useState function, and we are setting this equal to empty string at first. This is our actual state variable, and this is our state setter function. So if we want to actually access this state, we can get text, and if we want to change this state, we can use setText. Inside of our return statement, which should have some JSX, let's make some stuff happen. The first thing we want to do is make our actual text box, which we will use to set our state. So to do this, let's use JSX's built-in input tag. So to do that, we can just write input like this, and then it should autofill a closing tag for this. Input is basically just a text field where you can have the user just input whatever text you want from your keyboard. And then every time we type something, we want to update our text. So we can use our setText function that we made in our useState line. To do this, we can use the onChange feature of JSX. OnChange is just a tag we can pass into our input tag that allows us to specify some action we want to do every time the input is changed. So let me show you how to do this. Inside of our input tag here, the opening tag, let's make an argument called onChange. And then let's make equals and then curly brackets. And then inside of here, we need to pass in some function to be executed to basically take some action each time our text changes. By default, the first argument passed into onChange will be the actual text object within the text box. Most people will just denote this as E because it's just standard practice. So in our little arrow function, let's just write E and then arrow and then set text to E. Now, if this E were just a string of text, this would work. However, the input box stores E as an object, and to access the pure string from the text box, we need to write e.target.value like this. And once we've done that, we're now capturing the text from the text box. So, in summary, here's all this is doing. We have a JSX input tag that will create a typeable text box for us. We're accessing its onChange property, which will do some specified action each time the text changes. Any value of text is stored in this E object, and if we want to access the raw text in the object, we need to do e.target.value. So what we're doing is calling our setText function, which is just our setter function for our text state, and setting it equal to the string. Let me show you how this works in action. So I'll go ahead and just save this file here. And actually, before we run it, we want to display our state to actually show you how it works a little easier. So I'm going to make just, let's say a p tag right here. And then all I want to do is just display what our text state is currently equal to. So we'll just access it using curly brackets and then text as such. And remember, just as a reminder, anytime you want to put JavaScript within JSX, you always want to use curly brackets and you don't want to go without them, or else it will interpret it as literal text. So I'll go ahead and just save this file now. Now let's go into our app.jsx component and import this component in that we just made and render it. So we called it textbox. So let's just say import textbox, and then it should autofill based on the pathing. And then let's just go ahead and actually delete the buttons we have here for now. And let's instead just render a text box. Let's say text box, make sure you want to spell it exactly with capitalization. And then we can just render it in like that. And now, once we go ahead and save this, we can actually now test what this component actually does. You can see now we just have what looks like an empty text box on our screen here. Because we made it an input field, we can click inside of it and type whatever we want. So if we just go ahead and type hello, for instance, you'll see it prints out hello right underneath. And that all this is here, this hello right here, is basically just our p tag printing off the state. I could type literally whatever I wanted and it would update the state perfectly. So let me just say like, hello, in this episode, we're looking at state and how to use it in React. And you'll see it prints off exactly what I'm typing below in this p tag. Again, that is just this text here. And because we're using this JSX onChange property, every single time we change any letter at all in this text box, our state is updated. And because React is great about being reactive, it is literally re-rendering the component every single time I change anything. So it shows me typing in real time. So if I were to go into this box and I were to literally just like delete the T off end of React here, like that, the component is actually completely re-rendering very fast in the background. And if I were to delete more, re-renders again right here. If I were to type a letter in, it would re-render and so forth. And what that does is allows to update the state in real time so that you can access it like this, where it can display somewhere on your site or use it for other purpose you may use it for. And this is what's really cool about React. Each component we have can be broken into its own code chunk, and within that code chunk, we can store data that updates in real time and makes a web application completely reactive. 99% of the time, if you look at modern web pages and see some really cool and interactive web pages, they're probably using React or some other framework that's like React. Reactivity is not something that vanilla JavaScript excels at super well, and realistically, it's so much easier to build reactive web apps in React than with JavaScript alone. It's like comparing building a house with industrial equipment versus building it by hand. State is one of the key building blocks of React, and I'd argue probably the most important one because it's what makes React, well, React. In the very next video, we'll use what we've learned about props and state to look at how we can handle events and how we can extend state functions with the function we call useEffect. We've already done a bit of event handling with onClick and onChange, but we'll do a deeper dive in the next episode. I'll see you in the next one. Hey everyone, and welcome back to the React for Beginners series. In the last episode, we went over one of the key features of React in managing state. And in this episode, we're going to be looking at handling events. Handling events is very important in React because it's what allows us to change our state exactly how we want and when we want. Then we'll look at a React function called useEffect that will also come in handy. We've already done a couple of event handling things here and there in our previous episodes, but in this episode, we'll do a deeper dive to get a full understanding of how events work in React. First, to start off, there's two tags we're going to focus on and cover: onChange and onClick. The very last thing we left off with was a text box that we made as a component, and then we rendered it into our app.jsx file. Whenever we type something in this text box, our state is automatically updated and printed out right below our text box. So let's do a quick review of how this works so we're fully clear on this concept. So let's go ahead and take a look at our textbox.jsx component. In the last episode, we made this component, and as part of our input field, which represents our actual text box, we have this property right here that we call onChange, that runs some chunk of code, which the code that it runs is just this here, with this argument e, and then set text to e.target.value. I went over it pretty quickly in the last episode, so let me clarify how this works and how this actually updates our state. So input is the actual JSX tag that creates a text box for us automatically. Inside of the opening tag, just as with any other HTML or JSX opening tags, we can specify things like class name, ID, and all sorts of other things. With JSX specifically, we can specify event properties that basically signal for something to happen when some action occurs. Anytime we have any of these properties like onChange here, what we can do is write equals and then pass in some chunk of code, that being this chunk of code here, that we want to run whenever the event occurs or gets triggered. OnChange specifically is a property that gets triggered when anything inside the text box is altered in any way. So if I go into this text box here and I type one letter, the onChange runs. If I delete this letter, onChange runs. If I type 5 letters, onChange will run each of the 5 times I add a letter. Any change at all will trigger this onChange run, meaning every time I add a letter or delete a letter or modify something, this chunk of code here is running. And as always, when we're executing any JavaScript code inside of JSX notation, we want to make sure we use curly brackets surrounding whatever JavaScript code we're going to enter, hence why we're using curly brackets around this chunk of code here. So what is this chunk of code actually doing then? We have an arrow function here that has one argument, which we just call e, and then inside that function, we're calling our state setter function setText, which you went over last episode. This setter function sets the value of our text state. Inside of it, we're passing in e.target.value. So what is this whole e thing that we have going on here? It doesn't matter what we name this parameter, but it's typically standard practice to just use e because it stands for event. Now, why are we doing e.target.value right here? Well, let me just right click on this page here and open up the console, which you can normally just do by clicking inspect here. So console.log is JavaScript version of a print function, and it prints out in this console that you're seeing here if we just go ahead and go to this console tab. So if we ever use console.log, it'll now show up in this console menu here. And then let's go back to our code real quick. And then instead of having set text here, let's just go ahead and console log this e event. So instead of saying set text, I'm just going to replace this with console.log e like this. And then I'm going to go ahead and save this and then reopen our console menu here. And then I'm just going to delete a letter, and you see it prints this off. I'm going to type a letter, it prints this. I'll do this and keep going. And basically anytime this onChange event is triggered, which again is anytime that I type a letter or delete a letter, it will now go ahead and just run this console log e, which means that this event here being triggered is e. You'll notice all of these objects or events are just called synthetic base event. And if we can click this arrow here, it opens it up so we can see all the properties of this object. Now notice how we have a property here named target. And then if we open up and expand target, at the very top here, we have a property named value. If we click on these 3 dots here to go ahead and open it up, you can see that this is the actual text that we have just typed, as you can see reflected by our text box over here to the left. So basically, to get the text from a text field every time something is changed, we need to go into this event, which we just know as e. Then we need to look at the target property here. And then within that target property, we need to look at the value property. Hence, why if you look at our code, and we go back to what we were doing here, when you go back to doing set text with e.target.value, this is why we do e.target.value, because if we look at this, this event is e, we have this target property here, and then we have this value property within the target, hence why we use that notation. Let's go back into our code now and look at another thing we can do with onChange or just events in general. In this line of code with our onChange here that we have, we can only really commit one action because we can only pass in a single function definition to it. But what if we wanted to do multiple things on some of it? So to do this, we can make a separate function within our component that will handle the event. So inside this text box, I'm actually going to make a function up here. I'm just going to make a new function. I'm going to write function handle event. Then we're going to pass an e, which will be our argument for our event. And then with the parentheses here, make some space. Now let's change this onChange to say e handle event instead of setting text. So I'm just going to call the function we just made, which doesn't do anything just yet, but it will in a second. And then I'm just going to go ahead and pass an e. So we're just passing in the event as the event argument to our handle event function, which we're going to make in just a second. Just a moment ago, we switched between setting the text state and console logging the event. Let's actually do both now so we can commit more than one action within an event handler. So at the top of the function here, let's just go ahead and call our state setter function. So we're going to do set text, and we're going to do e.target.value. Oops, if I can spell it right. Target.value like that, which is just the same line of code that we had before. And then underneath that, let's also do a console log. So let's go ahead and say console.log. We're going to say the text has just changed. And then we're just going to go ahead and under this, let's do another console log. And let's just console log our actual event. So basically, every single time our text changes, we're calling this handle event function right here because we're passing it into our onChange. Whenever we do this function here, all we're doing is setting the state of our text using our setter function, which is defined up here, which went over last episode. And then we're just console logging two things. We're console logging a string that just says the text has changed. And then we're also console logging the actual event that we're passing into our event handler. Now let's go ahead and save this file. And I'm actually going to refresh this page to wipe the console out. I'm going to open the console here. And then every single time we're going to type anything, three things are going to happen. Let's see. I'm going to type A. The state is going to update, which reflects down here. And then it's going to print off that the text has just changed, and then it is going to print off the event. And that happens because that's what we specified here. Those are the exact steps. The state changes, we console log the text has just changed, and then we go ahead and console log E. If I, let's say, type 3 letters instead of just one, I do one more, and then one more. You can clearly see that every single time a change is being made, we are having 3 events happen. The state is updating, we are console logging the text has changed, and then we are console logging the event. And obviously, again, that happens on deletes as well. So if we were to just delete letters or change letters, it happens every single time. And we're going to get a pretty full console if we just keep doing that. Now, going back into our code, one of the most common mistakes that I see React beginners make is this. Instead of passing in a function definition to these event tags right here, they instead just pass in a function call. So what I mean by that is in this text box here, we're actually fully defining a function using arrow notation. Let's say I didn't need this e object and I just wanted to run this handle event function. So if I were to just, for instance, delete all this extra stuff with the arrow notation, and I were to delete this, and I were to just be doing a direct function call with handle event e, this does not work because this is just a function call, but we need an actual function definition. If I wanted to run this handle event function without passing in an event, I need to use parentheses still, but just have them empty. So don't fall into the trap of passing in just a function call because I see it happen all the time. Always write a function definition by specifying arguments inside the parentheses or just empty parentheses if there are no arguments. Use an arrow to denote that it's actually a function, and then write whatever code you need to do on the right side of the arrow. So let's just go ahead and Control Z, get it back to normal because this is the actual format that we want and the format that actually works. Now that we have a solid grasp of how onChange work, let's look at another property onClick, which you've already had a little bit of practice with. OnClick is probably the most common event property you're going to see in React. Why? Well, every single button you click on a web page has some onClick event. So to make React web pages interactive, you need onClick properties on a lot of things. So let's actually go back into our button component here that we made in one of our previous episodes. And then in our button component, we left off with a button tag that just has an onClick property inside of it. Lucky for us, the syntax of onClick is identical to that of onChange. The only difference is what actually triggers the event. Well, the name is pretty self-evident, but onClick means the event is triggered whenever the tag that is inside is clicked. So we have our onClick inside of our button tag here, specified right here. And then, therefore, if this button is clicked, we are running this chunk of code right here, which is basically just calling our setCountSetter function and then passing in count plus 1, which is just incrementing our count state variable by 1. Just so we can see what this button's doing again, let's go ahead and go into our app.jsx file. And instead of rendering in text box, let's actually go ahead and just render in button again. Then we'll go ahead and save this, and we are now back to having a button. Just like I mentioned a moment ago, we want to make sure we're passing in an actual function definition here to our event handler. So we have parentheses and then an arrow to show the arrow function. If I were to delete the parentheses and arrow and just simply call the state function setCount, let's see what happens. So if I were to delete this and make it just a function call instead of a function definition and go ahead and saved it, look, my button disappears. And then if I go ahead and open the console here, we're getting a hell of a lot of errors because it's saying we have infinite re-renders. Because we're passing in a function call and not a function definition, React thinks we're trying to just keep calling this function over and over and over again, which causes it to crash. So long story short, always have the parentheses and the arrow. Again, don't pass in a function call here to event handler, pass in a function definition. So I'll go ahead and just save this file again. And if we look at this button we made before and we click it, you can see that it just increments it each time we click it, which basically is just counting the number of clicks that it actually has. So why is this doing this? Well, remember with useState that we're initializing our count variable to 0 because we're specifying 0 within the actual useState function here. And then, just like we did with onChange, we have an event handler here. This time onClick that runs every time the button is clicked. The function we're calling in here is setCount, which is just our setter function that we made up here. And all we're doing is passing in count plus 1, which is basically just incrementing the count by 1 each time it is clicked. And because we're printing out our count state within our p tag inside the button, we're just printing off the count inside the button itself, hence why it is showing and updating in real time. There are tons and tons of options of things we can do with an onClick event, but one of the options would be to have a function that handles the event, just like we had with onChange. So let's actually go, and just like we did with onChange, let's make a function here. Let's say function handle event. And then I'm just not going to pass in any argument for now. I'm going to do curly brackets just so we know it is a function here. Now let's just say, just like last time, we want to log something to the console while altering our state. Inside the function, let's actually call setCount here, and let's pass in count plus 1, which is literally just what we're doing right here in this function. And then below that, let's just do this console log. We'll say state has been incremented by 1. And then all I want to do is, instead of calling setCount here, let's just call our handle event function that we have just created. So effectively, what this is doing is that anytime this onClick property is triggered, we are running this handle event function here, which just sets the count in the same way we were doing before, and then console logs that state has been incremented by 1. So we'll go ahead and just save this now. And then notice how this time we're not passing in any actual event as an argument, like we have empty parentheses here. And that's just because we don't actually need to access the event for what we're trying to do, but we could add it if we wanted to do something else. Now, make sure this code is saved. I'm going to go ahead and refresh the page here. So we have a blank console. And then now if we click this button, you can see it prints out that state has been incremented by 1. So it's really doing two actions. It's updating the state, which you can see reflected by this button here because it's updating in real time. And then it is also printing out the state has been incremented by 1 because we are also console logging that. And you can see that every single time that we click it, it is running again, and it's just stacking the same line here. So that's why it says 14, because it has run 14 separate times. And that's really all you need to know from a basic standpoint to get started using events, using onChange and onClick. Both of them work in the same way. They both take in some function that runs whenever the event occurs. OnChange occurs when some element like a text field is changed, and onClick happens when a user clicks an element like a button. Although we don't just have to have onClick inside of a button tag, we could literally have it in any other tag we wanted to. Like we could put this onClick, for instance, inside of our p tag here, and it would work pretty much just the same. It does not have to be in a button. It can be wherever you want. So as the last part of this video, I want to get into something extremely important in React and state management in general. One of the common ways to change state is what we just went over with events like onClick and onChange. However, what if you don't want to change state within one of these conditions, or you want to change state based on another piece of state? That's where this next function comes in, and it's called useEffect. So just like useState, useEffect is a function from React that allows us to manage the state. Before I go into what it is used for, let's quickly import it up here. And we can actually just add a comma after useState. So I'm going to say comma useEffect like this, and then press enter as well. Since they're both from React, so we're both importing them from React here. So you can just add a comma next to useState here. Let's just go ahead and save this file. So useEffect has two use cases in React. Use case number one, the reason for its name, is to handle some effect. An effect occurs if we change some other piece of state and want to listen for that change to happen. So what do I mean by that? Well, let's say we want to have some chunk of code run every time this count variable is changed here. A useEffect would listen for this count to change, and then every time it is changed, it would just run. The second use case of useEffect is to do some action every time the page loads, but not after that. We know that React re-renders a component every single time the state is changed, but what if you want to have some chunk of code that doesn't run upon re-render and only runs once the page is first loaded? We can also use useEffect for that, and I'll show you how to separate out these two use cases. So let's look at the first use case, which will be to just run some chunk of code whenever the state is changed. So to call the use function or the useEffect function that we just imported, all we need to do is type useEffect like this, and then parentheses for its argument. And then it takes in two arguments. The first argument is a function, and the second argument is a dependency array, which I'll go over in just a second. For the first argument, let's just write an empty arrow function by just doing parentheses, arrow, and then I'm going to do curly brackets, and I'm just going to make a space just so it looks a little bit neater and easier to read. And then for the second argument here, let's just pass in a empty array for now, and this will be what is called a dependency array. So again, takes in two arguments. The first argument here is a function, which encompasses all the empty space here, and the second argument here will always be an array. So what does this array actually do? Well, this is what we call a dependency array, and it's how we specify the pieces of state we want to watch out for. Anytime any variables inside the dependency array are changed, this useEffect function will run. So let's add count to this dependency array here. So we're going to go ahead and just add count inside of here. And then I'm actually going to delete this handle event function for right now, and then change our code here back to just setting the count, just so we can unclutter this and make it a little easier to read. So change this back to count. Go ahead and just save this page like that here. Okay, so now what's going to happen here? Well, every time we click this button, we're going to increment the count by 1. This useEffect function has count in its dependency array. So every time our count variable changes, this first function here that we have, this first argument, is going to run. And right now we don't have anything in it, so let's actually add something. So inside this useEffect, let's just add a console log here line. Let's say console.log. We're going to say count is now equal to, then we'll do plus here, and then set equal to count. So basically every time the count is incremented, this useEffect function should say count is now equal to, and then whatever it is equal to. And because this useEffect function has count in its dependency array, that means that every single time this count variable changes, this function is going to run. So basically, every time we click our button, that is changing count. When count changes, then this function runs, meaning we're going to console log out count is now equal to whatever. So to show you this in action, let me go ahead and just save this file here. I'm going to open up the console here. Let's clear this out and refresh. And then you can see it has started off initially saying count is equal to 0. And then let's look at what happens every time we click this button. I click it right here. We're changing the state of count. Therefore, this useEffect is running. So it says count is now equal to 1 because we have run this line inside of our useEffect here. If we go back, run it again, count is now equal to 2, count is 3, count is 4, count is 5, so forth, and you get the picture. This is because every single time this onClick is running, we're changing the state of count, and because count is the dependency array, therefore we are running this chunk of code. Therefore, every single click means we are printing off that the count is now equal to whatever it currently is. So let me show you something interesting real quick that you might have noticed when you first loaded the page. So if we just refresh the page, actually I'll exit this out here, and I just go ahead and refresh. Without even clicking the button, you'll see that it has already console logged our count has just changed line. So why is this? Well, every time a component loads for the very first time, the stuff inside the useEffect will run before any event happens. And notice how it actually ran twice inside of here. So the first run happens right when the page is loaded up, just like I said. The second run happens because whenever we call this useState function here, we're actually setting our count variable, which is technically changing it, causing this useEffect to actually run. And then anytime after that, it only runs when it is clicked. So notice, like I said, it runs twice when it first loads. Then after that, it only runs, once, obviously, each time it is clicked. To show you how the dependency array affects the useEffect function, let's change some things around in our code. So let's actually clear this count out of our dependency array, and just make it so that the array is completely empty. And then if we go ahead and just save this, let's go look at our console again. Let's clear this out and let's go ahead and refresh. Obviously, we have these things now saying count is not equal to 0, but then notice every time we click it, nothing is being console logged off. And no amount of clicks is going to trigger this useEffect function now, because since it is empty in the dependency array, this means that it will only run right when the first page is loaded up, and we're not running it every single time count is changed now because it's no longer in the dependency array. Therefore, when you click it, nothing actually happens now. Because this is actually an array here and not just like a single variable, we could have as many pieces of state here as we wanted. So let's make another piece of state up here. Let's just do const, and we're going to say count2 and then set count2. These are not very good naming conventions, but for now I'm just trying to get this idea across. And we'll say useState0. This will also be initialized at 0. So then we'll go ahead and save this. And then now let's make another actual button to monitor our second count. So I'm going to copy and paste this entire button chunk here. And then I'm actually just going to paste that here. I need to tab to get it a little bit nicer, like this. And then I'm going to make sure everything here says set count2 and then count. So I'm going to change this to set count2. Let's say count2. And then we will say count2 right here. And then notice that everything is being highlighted red right now. It's getting mad that we don't have a single tag being returned. Instead, we have like 2 separate buttons. So let's just go ahead and make some empty tags here just to encompass everything. So I'm going to do this, do it like that. And then let's just tab this in, make it look a little neater. And then go ahead and save it. And voila, now we have 2 buttons. And then now let's actually add both of our count state variables into our dependency array back in. So I add count back in here. And then we're just going to go ahead and add count2 like this. And then if we go ahead and save this and open up the console, go ahead and clear this out. Now, every time we click either of the buttons, it is going to run this line of code here. And then I could click this one and it would do the same thing. And then I could just keep going pretty much infinitely. And actually now, because we have 2 buttons here, technically it's not correct what it's printing off because we're actually just printing off count. So I'm just going to go ahead and just change this just for now, just to say count has just changed. Go ahead and save that, open up our console, clear this out, refresh it, and then now anytime either of the buttons is clicked, it's going to print out count has just changed. And again, it's just stacking it here, 18 different clicks. So we can just keep clicking it, and every single time it'll print out count has just changed. And it works on both button 1 and button 2 because we have 2 things in our dependency array, not just 1. So anytime either of these variables are changed, the useEffect will run. And that's an important point to make, that it does not mean that both of them have to change. It just means that one of them in the array has to change for the useEffect to run. So if just one of these is changed, like count2, it'll run. If just count and not count2 is changed, it'll also run, because it is kind of an or thing and not an and thing. Although, note that we're still using console logging that count has just changed. What if we want to have separate effects for each of the counts? So I print something different off between each one. We could always just make another useEffect to do this. So I'm actually going to remove count2 from this useEffect here, so it just has count. And then what I'm going to do is I'm just going to copy and paste this useEffect here. I'm going to copy it and paste it like this. And instead of saying count in this one, I'm just going to go ahead and say this in count2 here. And then right here, we're going to say count2 has just changed. And we'll go ahead and save this file. Now that they're separated, anytime we click button 1, the first useEffect will run here. Anytime we click button 2, the second useEffect will run. And that all depends on which state we're modifying with our onClick events down here in our JSX. So to show you this, if we just go ahead and make sure this file is saved, we go in our console here, let's go ahead and clear it out. I'll just completely refresh here. And then we can click on whatever button we want. Let's say we want to click on button 1 first. It'll print off count has just changed, count has just changed, count has just changed each time. Then we want to click button 2. Now it's printing off count 2 has just changed. So we can click each one, we can go back and forth. Count has just changed, count 2 has just changed. Count has just changed, count 2 has just changed, and so forth. Hopefully you get the picture. And again, just so we're on the same page, if I were to instance click the first button like this, what that is doing is triggering this onClick event in the first function, which is then setting our count to be incremented by 1. And then, because the count variable is modified, this useEffect function is going to recognize that, since count is in a dependency array, and it's going to console log this line here and go ahead and run this function. And the same logic applies for button 2. Button 2 has this onClick property here that just modifies count2 This use effect has count2 in the dependency array, so it recognizes that it's just changed, and every time it is changed, it just console logs count2 has just changed. And now, because I've got two pieces of state, these two pieces of state are unique and hold their own individual count numbers, meaning count2 and count1 go up separately depending on how much we click each button. So hopefully now you should have a decent understanding of how a use effect works and what it does, and what its actual dependency array looks like and what that does as well. Now I want to shift our focus to look at the second use case of use effect, which you've already actually seen. The second use case was to run some chunk of code just when the first component loads, which we already did with our first count. That's exactly what happened when we removed all items from our dependency array and made it empty. So let's actually, for now, let's go ahead and delete the second button here. And let's look at the first button just so I can get this point across. So I'm going to delete this first button here, and then I'm just going to go ahead and delete this second use effect here. And then I'm just going to go ahead and save it, just so we're back with working with one button and one use effect to make it a little simpler. Now let's actually make a new use effect. And this time I'm going to make the dependency array completely empty. So inside of this new use effect function, let's just type it out. I want to make it up here. I'm going to make a new use effect here. Make an arrow function like normal for our first argument. And then let's just make a dependency array for now. And then inside the use effect function, all I'm going to do is just, for now, console.log page has just been rendered. So because when we have an empty dependency array, that means this use effect will only run once the page is first rendered. And it won't run on any following events unless the page has been reloaded completely. To show you this, if we just go ahead and make sure our page is saved and we go ahead and open our console, let's do this. Let's just go ahead and refresh this. You can see it'll say page has just been rendered and it says count has just been changed. And then if we click this button, we're only invoking the second use effect since count is being changed and count is in the dependency array. However, notice that we're never invoking the first use effect again because it'll only run once the page is first loaded if it is completely empty in the dependency array. So what do I mean when I mention the page has to be completely reloaded for this use effect to run again? Well, you need to have some event like a refresh that completely remounts the component. I won't get into the advanced aspects of it, but basically as soon as a component is first rendered, we'll say it is mounted. And even though it may re-render a bunch of times due to state changes, it still stays mounted that whole time. The only thing that'll cause it to get mounted again is if we completely render the page from scratch again, like refresh it like this. Hence why the use effect will now run again every time the page is completely reloaded or refreshed. One of the very common use cases for this type of use effect is if we need to load data into a component. Let's say we have an external source of data like a database that we're calling and grabbing data from. If we want to grab the data within a component, we don't want to call this database every single time the page is re-rendered, because then it would call the database anytime any state changed at all. So if we used a use effect with no dependency array, just like we're doing at this one, we could easily have a way to load data into the component when it first renders. Loading data from an external source is a bit more advanced, so we're going to go over it in this tutorial, but I'll definitely go over that in a future video. Before you end this episode though, I need to go over a huge pitfall of React beginners. I myself fell into this trap so many times when I was first getting started out, and it was incredibly frustrating trying to figure out what I was doing wrong. Do not, and I repeat, do not modify state within a use effect that has that piece of state in the dependency array. So for example, in this use effect here, we have count in our dependency array. If I go into this use effect now, and I modify this count, and I say set count plus 1, let's actually analyze what happens here. So the page first renders, both these use effects are going to run. And then inside of this, we're modifying the count to be equal to count plus run. Our dependency array here now sees that count has been changed, so it runs the use effect again, which then triggers the count to run, which then this will see that it's been changed, so the function runs once again. So do you see the problem here? We're creating an infinite loop. If we modify the state inside the use effect of something that is in the dependency array, we're going to infinitely run the use effect function. Don't believe me? Well, watch this. Let's leave this console log here. Just keep a set count here, and I'm going to go ahead and save this. And look what's happening. This button is being infinitely incremented by 1, and it's never going to stop unless I stop it. So I'm actually really quick just going to delete this before I completely crash my program. I'm just going to do that, Control Save, and now it's stopped. But it was running for a good amount of time, and now it's at 143,000. Which means our component re-rendered 143,000 times because of the infinite loop we just created. So let's just go ahead and just go back to console logging this, saying count has just changed. Long story short, Don't do what I just did, or you'll create an infinite loop. It might crash your program. Another hugely common mistake I see is developers changing the state of their code in just the function itself, or the component itself, instead of putting it inside of an event like onClick, or putting it inside of a useEffect function. So if I just go into the bulk part of the component without even putting it inside of useEffect or an event handler, and I just write set count, count plus one, kind of tile here open, and it's not inside of the thing, then this page isn't going to load for the exact same reason as before. All of this code within our button component is going to rerun every time the state changes. So if the state changes in this main chunk of code here, that means it'll again create an infinite loop of re-rendering. And in fact, if I actually save this and try and run it now, it won't even infinitely increment the button anymore. The page will just straight up crash. So if you actually just look in the console, you can see it just straight up crashed here. We're getting a bunch of errors. And it's saying too many re-renders. React limits the number of renders to prevent an infinite loop, because that is exactly what would happen. So in summary, mistake 1 is changing the state inside of a useEffect that has the same state in the dependency array, which I showed you with the infinitely incrementing button. And mistake 2 is what we just saw, which is changing the state inside of the function itself. So let's go ahead and delete this. Let's make sure we get to a point we're not going to infinitely render our app anymore. Save it, and now our button is back to normal and is no longer going to crash. So if you're going to modify state, you need to do it in some event like onClick or onChange, or you need to do it inside of a useEffect that doesn't have that same state in the dependency array. So you could do it inside of a useEffect with no dependency array, or you could do it in a useEffect that doesn't have that piece of state in the array. For example, let's say I have another piece of state called filter. So I'm going to go ahead and actually delete this line here. I'm going to copy this line and then paste it. Let's make a new piece of state. I'm going to say filter, and then we're going to say set filter, and then we're going to say useState and set it to none by default. And then let's say in this useEffect here, where we're doing our count, we have count in our dependency array. So I could call set filter in here. Just say set filter plus like L or something. And nothing bad is going to happen because filter is not in the dependency array of this useEffect. So modifying in the useEffect is perfectly fine. But if I were to do something like this, and I were to add filter to the dependency array, now that's a problem because we're making it an infinite loop. And just to show you this, if I were to just do something like console.log filter here, and then I were going to save this and open up our console, it's going to get real chaotic in just a second. I can save it, look at our console, and look what's going on. And it's actually, I think, crashing my console because I can't really scroll. So I'm going to go ahead and just delete this before it crashes my program again. Let's just delete this line here like that. Let's go ahead and save it so it stops infinitely rerunning our program. Again, just to drive this point home, just be very careful about where you're modifying the state and that you're doing it in a way that won't cause an infinite loop. And with that, we're going to wrap up this episode of managing state and handling events. In this episode, you learn how to deal with events using JSX tags like onClick and onChange, as well as learn how to properly manage state using React's useEffect function. In the next episode, we'll go over rendering lists and conditional rendering of certain items or components. These two things are hugely valuable skills that'll open up the doors of React development and allow you to actually build some pretty cool things. I'll see you in the next one. Hey everyone, and welcome back to the React series for beginners. In this episode, we're going to go over how to render lists in React and how to also deal with conditional rendering in React. Rendering lists refers to being able to render something that has multiple pieces of data in it, like an array or an object. Conditional rendering means being able to selectively choose what is displayed based on some conditions, kind of like an if statement from typical coding. So we'll start first with rendering lists. To get into list rendering, let's first make a new component that we can render. Let's go into our source folder here and click new file. And let's make a new file just for now. Let's just call it textblock.jsx like this. And then inside, just like any other React component, let's write export function textblock, parentheses here for any props we want to add in. And then we'll do this. And then obviously, since it's a React component, we want to return JSX. Let's do the return statement here. And then for now, let's just do an empty tag. And then inside of this, I'm going to make a button. And then inside of this button, all I want to do for right now is just say hello. So basically just made a little text block component that just has an empty button inside of it. If we go ahead and save this, we now go to our app.jsx file and you wanted to render this new text block component we just made. We could just go up top here. We could just go ahead and import it. Let's say import text block like this. And then we could just type it like this here, just as we render any other component. Then we can go ahead and save this. And now you can see we have a button that says hello because this is our text block component. If we wanted to render more of these, we could just copy and paste this a bunch of times, right? If I wanted 2 of them, I could just do this. If I wanted 3 of them, I could just do this, and so forth. But what if we wanted to render 100 of these? It's not efficient to have to type a component out every single time we want to render it. And it's not dynamic either, since it's statically coded into the page. And this is where list rendering comes in. To render multiple of something, we can use a super helpful function called map, which basically just maps every element in some array to some JSX code. Because we're going to use the map function, we're going to need to make an array first. So up here in our actual app component, let's make a new array. I'm just going to write const, let's name it myArray, and then we're going to do a constructor function for our array and say array5.fill equals true. So all this line is basically doing here is making a new variable called myArray, and then we're creating a new array using this new array constructor with JavaScript. We're specifying 5 because we want 5 total elements in our array, which means our array will be 5 elements long. And then for now, we're just filling every single array element with the value true. So all this basis line basically does is makes an array that looks something like this. It would just be like true, 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 and it looks something like that. Now, because we have an array of 5 elements, we can now render any tag or component 5 times if we use this array. Let me show you how to do this using the map function. So we can actually call the map function inside of our component return, meaning we're passing it inside where we would normally put JSX code, which would be in here. But the map function is going to call JavaScript, so I want to use curly brackets to specify our code that we're going to write some JavaScript. So let's go ahead and just delete these here, and then let's put in some curly brackets here, just so we know we're going to use JavaScript. To use the map function, you're going to call it on an array or object. So to do that, we can just access the array we made. It's called myArray, and then we can type .map just like this. And then similar to how we work with other JavaScript functions, we're going to pass in an arrow function inside this map function here. And I'll explain how it works. So I'll make parentheses here right now. And for right now, we don't actually need any arguments. But I'm just going to do the arrow and then do our curly brackets like this. So now you should have a function, a map function that looks something like this. Now let's review what we're trying to do with this map function. We want to use this array of 5 elements to display 5 text block components. So how do we actually do that? Well, within a map function, if we want to map every element to some component like we're trying to do, we need to have the map function return JSX for each element. So to do that, inside of here, we need to actually write a return statement so that every single element returns some sort of JSX. And then inside of our return statement, let's just go ahead and specify the text block component we made earlier, like this. This is just specifying that for every element, we're returning a JSX component. In our case, we are returning this text block component that we just made. So in summary, we're calling a map function on our array of 5 elements. Inside this map function here, we need to pass in a function that specifies what to do with each element. All our function is doing is returning this text block component. There are 5 elements in our array up here that we made because we filled it with 5. So therefore, all this is doing is just going to render 5 text blocks. And we can actually see that if we go ahead and save this code here, you can now see that we have 5 text blocks. This method of making an array and just filling it works well if you're trying to work with a fixed number of components that you want and don't want to type every component render out. And the great thing about doing it this way is that we could just change this number up here that we have if I wanted to specify how many blocks we actually run a render. So instead of 5, let's say I want to do 25. Save that. Now we have 25 text blocks here. Instead of 25, let me just go ahead and put 225. Save it, and now we have 225 text blocks here. So if we know beforehand that we want to code a fixed number of elements into a list, we can use this method here of just making an array, filling it with that number of elements, and then using the map function to actually just return whatever component you wanted to return. However, really quickly, let's check out one small issue we have with our code. If we go ahead and just inspect this and open up our console here, and then head to our console here, you'll see that we have this warning here that says each child in a list should have a unique key prop. With React, anytime you're doing list rendering, it's standard practice to make a unique key for each element that you're rendering. So basically, the React program wants to see every item rendered has a unique ID that can be used to identify it. The program will never cause any error from this, but it'll always give you a warning if you don't do this. Now I know I shouldn't, but for right now I'm actually going to ignore this warning and I'll show you how to correct it in the next example that we use. So for our very next example, I want to combine what we've learned about props to fill in with what we just learned about using the map function. So let's take a look at our text blocks component here. Right now, we don't have any actual props in it. So text block, we don't have any actual props that are passing in right here. And we're just statically coding this hello right inside the button tag here. Now, instead of just statically coding this prop inside here, I actually want to instead be able to customize what every single button says in a list rendering type of way. So I'm going to make a prop using destructuring. So I'm going to add curly brackets here, and I'm just going to call it text for right now. And then instead of passing in hello right here, I'm just going to go ahead and pass in this text prop that we just made. This now allows us to pass in a text prop to every text block that we render, and that text will then be displayed inside of this button tag instead of just the word hello. So now let's go ahead and save this, and let's go ahead and go back into our app here. And right now we just have 225 empty buttons because we're not passing any props, therefore the text is empty on all these. And we're using this array obviously just to fill in those 225 elements. Instead of doing a filler array, actually, I'm going to go ahead and just delete this here. And I'm going to make a new array with just a couple of strings in it. So inside this array here, I'm going to make an array of a couple of animals here. We'll just say dog, cat, horse, mouse, and fox, just like this. So now this myArray variable is 5 elements, where each element is its own unique string. And now whenever we render our buttons, we want to actually access the contents of our array. So let's make an argument inside of our arrow function down here, inside of our map. So I'm just going to call this argument element for right now. Let's just add it to our arrow function here, because it'll represent each individual element of our array. So what do we want to do now? Well, if we go ahead and just go ahead and save this, and then we go back into our text block component, we can see that we've made this text prop that we're passing into the actual text field. So each time we render a text block, we should now pass in a text prop into it. So what we want to do now is make a new prop on this text block render here that we call text. And then what are we going to set it equal to? Well, all this map is doing here is basically creating an element for each mapping of the array, or basically for each element of the array. So for our text argument here, we can just go ahead and plug in element like this. So basically what this is doing is that at the first iteration of this mapping, element is equal to dog. The next iteration, it is equal to cat. Next iteration is equal to horse, and so forth, because it just goes in order of our array. A map function, a way to think about it, is basically kind of like a for loop in a sense. If we go ahead and save this page here, and now we look at our site, we now have 5 text blocks, each with their own unique value, each representing one item in the array we made, because we use this map function down here to map each of them to their own text block. And now that we have this set up, I'm going to go ahead and revisit that warning I was telling you about just a moment ago. So I'm going to refresh this page here, and I'm going to reopen our console, and you can see that we're still getting this warning about each child in a list should have a unique key prop. So sometimes when you're working with an array of objects, each object may have some sort of ID for that object that you could easily plug in as a key. But since we're using just an array of strings right now, we don't actually really have that. We don't have some sort of ID to really work with here. So to get around this, inside of our map function, I'm actually going to make a second argument here next to element that I'm just going to call index. By default, when you make arguments in a map like this, the first argument that you can name whatever, we named it element, the first argument always represents the actual items in the array, and the second argument will actually represent the index of each item in the array. So for instance, on the first iteration of the mapping, element is equal to dog, index is equal to 0. On the next iteration, element is equal to cat, index is equal to 1, and hopefully you get the picture. To silence this warning for now, what we can do is just pass in the index of each element, because it'll be unique to each element since there's only one index per element. To do that, let's go into our text blocks render here, and then let's just go ahead and specify key, like this, and then we just want to pass in the index. So key isn't an actual prop that we have inside of our component, but key is recognized by React as a keyword. Anytime you're rendering lists or arrays like this in React, you're usually always going to want to have a key tag in whatever it is you're rendering, and put something that is unique like the index. So if we go ahead and save this, and then refresh our page here, open up our console, you can see that we no longer have this warning, and it's no longer giving us a problem. Now that we've got this figured out with the array rendering, the next thing I want to show you is how we can render an array of objects instead of just an array of strings or numbers. The same principles apply to rendering an array of objects because we're still using an array and the map function, but we'll add a bit more to what we're rendering. So to look at this, let's envision a new scenario we want for our React app. Let's say we have an online store, and our store contains 3 items that people can look at and purchase. Each of these 3 items has a title, a description, and a price on it. To reflect these properties, let's make a new component. So let's go into here, let's make a new file, and let's just go ahead and make a new component. I'm going to call it storeitem.jsx. And then to make our component, we're just going to write export function store item. make our parentheses for our props here, and then we'll do the curly brackets. And then, like always, in a React component, we want to return JSX. Let's do a return statement. And then for now, we're just going to do empty tags like this. And then for our store item, we're going to want 3 props for each of our items. So let's go ahead and go in here. Let's specify curly brackets, and then let's specify the props that we want. So let's think about this. For items, we're going to want, let's say, for each one, a title. We're going to want a description, which will just say a desk. And then we'll also want a price for the item. And those will be the 3 things that set each item apart from each other. And then inside of our return for our component here, let's make a tag for each one of our props. So we'll just do, let's say, an h1 tag. And for this, we're going to pass in a title prop. And then for description, let's do a p tag for this one. And then for that, we will just say desk for description. And then for price, let's do a button for price, because normally price buttons are clickable. So we'll do a button like this, and then we will just pass in price as so. And for right now, this styling isn't going to look super good because we're not actually doing any custom CSS right now. But hopefully you get the picture of what we're doing here. We're just making a tag for each one of our props. Now, anytime we render any of this store item component that we have, we're going to want to pass in each of these 3 props that we've just made so we can fill in all of these tags down here. So for now, let's go ahead and save this, and let's go back to our app.jsx component now. And now we'll just create some sample items for our store as objects. So I'm actually going to delete this here. Let's make a object. I'm going to say const item1 equals title. We're just passing as bat. Let's pretend we're doing some like baseball equipment, right? We'll have bat. We'll say description, metal bat for baseball. And then we'll have another property that says price is equal to 50. And then let's say we want to have, let's say 3 items here. I'm just going to go ahead and copy this. We're going to paste it twice. And then let's just rename these here. So we'll have item 2, and then we will have item 3. For title for item 2, let's just go ahead and say ball like this. And then for description, let's just write standard baseball. And then for this third one, let's do title helmet. And then we're just going to do description, baseball, helmet. And then for prices, let's just say item 2, we'll do 5. And then item 3, we will do 25 like this. And let's now just go ahead and just save it. And then now instead of making an array of just a few strings like this, let's actually make our array full of these objects that we just made. So I'm just going to cut this and just paste it below our objects here. Make some room up here. And then let's replace these array elements with the objects instead that we just made. So inside of here, let's pass in item 1, let's pass in item 2, and then let's pass in item 3. Now what we've essentially done is created an array filled with 3 objects. Now let's look at actually rendering out a store item component for each one of these array elements. We have our map function already in place, and our element and index already defined as our arguments down here inside of our map. Because we're now dealing with objects, this element right here, this element argument, is going to be equal to an object at each iteration of this mapping. So for example, on the first item, element will be equal to item 1. On the next iteration, element will be equal to item 2. And then on the last iteration, element will be equal to item 3. So then let's look at our component that we're actually rendering down here. Let's go ahead and delete text block for now since we're done using that. And now let's render a store item component that we just made. Let's render store item just like this. And then we want to pass in a title, description, and price for each one of these store items, because that's what we defined as our 3 props inside of here. So looking at this, how are we going to do this? Well, we can just pass in the title, description, and price just like we would any other props. The only difference now is this time we'll need to reference the properties of our element object. So to make our props, let me show you. To make a title prop, to pass in, we want to do title, and then all we want to do is access element.title. Because again, this element right here is representing each individual object in our array. And then we want to do the same now for description and price. So let's do desk for description. That will be equal to element.desk. And then price will be equal to element.price, just like this. And then just so we don't get any warning, I'm actually going to go ahead and make a key tag and make it equal to our index, just like last time. Just like this. And now we are successfully rendering them. All we're doing here is basically the same thing as before, except now we have an array full of objects instead of an array of strings. For each element in the array, we're just returning one of the store item components, and we're just passing in 3 props to each store item, which represent the properties that, again, we made in our component here, which, of course, we named title, desk, price. So we want to make sure that those match exactly in here. So we have title here, we have desk here, and then we have price. And then for each of these props, we are just passing in the object itself and then each of its properties. If we go ahead and just save this now, it should display, actually our page is blank. Let me look at store item not defined. Oh, okay. So we forgot to import our store item. So let's go in here, make sure we import store item here. Let's try again. Let's save it now. And now it actually works. So now you can see we have 3 store items on our page, 1 for each of the objects. And each object has props for title, description, and price. Now clearly it's not formatted super nice since we haven't added any custom CSS, but you can clearly see that we have 3 distinct components here. Component 1, component 2, and then component 3. And let's make a quick upgrade to this component real quick. It's kind of inconvenient to have to type out every single prop like this individually. So right here we're typing out title, then we're typing out description, and then we're typing out price as well. So it's kind of inconvenient to actually do that. So instead of doing that, let's just pass in one object prop that represents the entire object. And then inside the component, we will specify the individual fields. So to do that, let's just go ahead and take these here. Everything from price over. Let's just go ahead and delete that. So let's delete all this stuff. And then I'm going to make a new prop and just call it item. And then all I'm going to do here is simply just pass in the element, because this element is already representing our actual object. So let's go ahead and save this here. And then let's go into our store item component. And now we want to remove these 3 props and make them just one called item. So let's remove these. Let's make it just called item like this. And then for our fields, we need to specify item dot whatever. So item dot title, we're going to do item dot desk for description, and then item dot price like this. And now if we go ahead and save this here, it looks the exact same. And just so we're clear on this, let's look at this a little more. So again, we have this item prop here, and we're just doing item dot title, item dot desk, and item dot price. Why does this work? Well, if we go into our app.jsx here, you can see that for our item prop, we are just passing an element. Well, each element is equal to each one of these objects in our array. So for example, on the first run of the map, element is item 1, and then it's item 2, and then it's item 3. And each of these has 3 properties: title, desk, and price. Hence why in our actual component here, we can do item.title, item.desk, and item.price. So it's actually a bit more writing in this component since we're just kind of adding these item dots in front of them. But it saves us quite a bit of writing in this component, so that we don't actually have to pass in every single prop individually. We can just pass in kind of a big object for this. Anytime you have an array of things in React, whether it be an array of objects like we have here, or like an array of numbers or strings like we had before, whatever it may be, the way to render out multiple pieces of JSX based on that array is the map function. This map function is extremely commonly used, and you should try and get very comfortable with it because it has a lot of use cases and is one of the more common functions that you're going to see in React. Now that we've learned this map function and how to use it to render multiple things, the next thing we should look at is something called conditional rendering. Conditional rendering is when we choose what to render based on some condition. Think of it like an if statement, but for React. If some condition is true, we display some component. If the condition is false, we display a different component. There's a lot of use cases for something like conditional rendering. Like for example, if somebody clicks a button and after it gets clicked, we need to display some other component like a drop-down menu, for instance. To set up a new scenario, let's actually go back into our button component that we made in one of the first episodes. So I want to now change what this button does. Instead of just incrementing some counting variable from our state, I instead want to use this button to open up a menu. When this button is clicked, I want one of our store item components to pop up. So it's basically like a show item button. So if it's clicked for the first time, it'll show it, and then if it's clicked again, it'll hide it, and that process could repeat forever. So because I want to completely revamp this button, let's actually wipe out all this old code we have from the last episodes. So we'll go ahead and just completely clear it out. And then I actually want to make a piece of state that's going to be a Boolean value that we can use to turn the button on and off. So let's go ahead and write a new piece of state here. Let's just call it, let's say show, and then we'll say set show. And then we want it to be Boolean. Let's make it false by default, so that should be the starting value. This way we're making a new state variable called show, and we're setting it to false. And then in our onClick event here, instead of messing with setCount, we don't have that function anymore. So let's change this to setShow here. And then let's go ahead and just delete this count plus 1 that we have going on for right now. Now the question is, how should we set our show variable once this button is clicked? Well, we should set it equal to the opposite of whatever it currently is, if it's Boolean. So if the show is currently true, when clicked it should change to false. And then if it's currently false and it's clicked, it should change to true. And then that keeps going on forever and ever. So to do that, we can just actually write exclamation point show like this. As we know, exclamation point is the not operator, meaning for Booleans, it'll be the opposite of what it currently is. So for example, if show is true, then not show is equal to false. Hence why this should work if we're using it to set it to opposite of the current value that it is. Now we should go ahead and change the text that our button is displaying based on what the value of show currently is. If show is true, that means that it is already showing, so the button should say hide item, so that users know if they click again, the item will hide. If show is equal to false, then the button should say show item, so users know they could click it and show it. One way we could do this would be with the ternary operator that most languages have, and we can do that inside of our JSX. To do that inside of our p tag, we would just use curly brackets, which we already have, and then we could write an if statement using the ternary operator, which, if you're not familiar with it, is basically an if-else statement using a question mark and a colon for syntax. To show you how to use it, let's go ahead and write it. So I'm just going to write show equals true like this. And then if it's true, we want to display hide item. So we're going to use a question mark, and then we're going to say hide item, and then to denote when the condition is true. And then if it's not true, meaning our else statement, we use colon to denote it. So I'll write colon. And if that's the case, we just want to write show item, and that reflects what we just went over. All this entire line is saying is that if show is true, then you want to display hide item. Otherwise, if it's not true, we're just going to display show item. And real quick, just because we're getting a little bit of overflow here, I'm going to make this a little bit wider, so it's a little easier to see and make our actual site a little bit narrower. And let's go ahead and just save this file. And now if we go back into our app.jsx file real quick, let's delete all the stuff with the mapping for our list rendering for right now. So let's just go ahead and let's just delete this. And then for now, let's just render a singular button in here. So let's just call the render component here. And then if we just go ahead and save the page here, and actually just so we're not mapping, I'm actually going to delete all of this here and just render a button by itself. Just do it like this. I'm going to go ahead and delete this array here. And I'm going to go ahead and just keep the items for now because I might use them in just a second. But I'll go ahead and just save this. And now we have a button on our page that defaults to saying show item. Then if we click it, it goes to hide item because our onClick was triggered. So let's go back to our button real quick here. Just to review that, we have our show state here. And then our onClick is just setting the show equal to the opposite of what it currently is. So if it is true, that means we will be showing hide item. And then we click it, and then it is set to show item because we're using this if conditional statement here basically, where it's basically saying if show is true, then we're going to display hide item. If it is false, we are going to display show item. But if we're going to use this button here to display one of our store items, then showing the text on this button is only part of the problem. Ideally, we would use this show button to actually show something on our screen and not just change the text within itself. So let's actually combine everything we've learned so far about components, props, state, and now conditional rendering to make this. So for our scenario, we want this button to display a store item component whenever it is clicked. Inside of our app.jsx file, we should check if this button is clicked or not. And if it is, we should display store item. But in our case, this app component here would be our parent component. And then the button component along with a store item component would be like sibling components. So the real question is, how would we communicate between the button and the store item? The answer to that question is by using props to pass down information from our parent component, which is app.jsx, to our children components, which would just be button.jsx and storeitem.jsx. So let's do exactly that. In our app.jsx file, we need to have a piece of state that watches for the button to be clicked. That way we can know when to display the store item. So to do this, let's actually go up here in our app. Let's make a new piece of state. I'm going to write const, we'll do show item, and then set show item like this. And then we're going to set equal to use state. And then by default, it should be equal to false, just like it is in our button. And this is basically the exact same piece of state we actually have in our button component here. except here we're just moving up to the parent component. So we're just shifting the functionality up from the child component to the parent component. Let's do a little something here now. So we're going to keep track of whether the button is showing or not within the parent component, which is just this app.jsx file. So now let's go ahead and go into our button component here, and let's go ahead and delete this piece of state because we won't actually be needing it anymore. And then what we can do is pass down the show item and set show item into our button. So if I actually go into our app here for our button, let's make a show prop, and we're going to pass in show item. And then let's also make a set show prop, which will just be set show item, just like that. So instead of keeping track of the state within our button component, we're keeping track of it here in app.jsx. And then if we want to access or modify that state in our button component, we can use these props here that we're passing down to actually access it. So to do that, let's go into our button component and let's add in our 2 new props up here. So in addition to having color, let's just add the 2 new props. And you want to make sure they match the name exactly. So we have show and we have set show. So we'll do just that. We'll say show, set show, and then color like this. And we conveniently name the props show and set show. That way they could still be running this code in the JSX because we're still calling a set show function and a show function. The difference is now these props are just coming from the parent component here. The very last thing we need to do in order to get this code to work is to add our conditional statement to display the item. Just like we did with our button, we need to write a conditional statement to display the store item if the button is clicked. So if show item is true, we should show store item. If show item is false, we should not show store item. So we'll do the same ternary operator we use for button. So let's actually go below our button here. Let's go ahead and just make curly brackets so it knows we're doing JavaScript. And then we're going to do a ternary operator. So we're going to say if show item is equal to true, then what do we want to do? Then we want to make a store item component. And then here, just like before, we want to pass in an actual item here. So let's just pass in item 1 for right now. Because we're passing in item 1, let me just go ahead and get rid of item 2 and item 3 here, clear up some space. So basically what this is saying here is if show item is true, we want to render a store item component that is passing in item 1. And then we want to make the condition for if it's false. So we'll say if it's false. And then for now, let's just render in absolutely nothing. So we'll just do an empty tag just like this. And that red little error we're having should go away. And now we should have a working conditional statement that uses a button to communicate with this sibling component store item and displays it if the button is clicked. So just so we're clear, we have this piece of state up here that says show item and set show item. And we're passing these down into our button component. And then inside of our button here, we can basically change the prop that we just passed down. So every time it is clicked, we're changing the prop to be the opposite of what it currently is. So if it is true, it'll be turned to false. If it is false, it'll be turned to true. And then right below that, inside this app.jsx, we're checking that. We're saying, okay, if show item is true, we want to display a store item. If it's false, we just want to display nothing. If we just go ahead and Control-S this file, and then Control-S this file and save it, and then we just refresh this page here, we can now see it in action. So when I click it for the first time, it now displays the store item, which is just item 1 for us. It's this item here that has metal bat for baseball with the price of 50. And then if we were to click hide item, it would go away. And then if we click it again, it goes back to show item here, shows the item, hide item, and we can keep going back and forth as many times as we want. And this behavior would just keep switching back and forth. So now we have a functional button that displays some other component every single time it is clicked. And this is actually the exact same logic that you use for something like a drop-down menu, for instance. Imagine you have, for instance, in the top right of your screen, like a picture for your profile and your settings or whatever. Whenever you click it, you want to have a drop-down menu that gives you some options, like go into your settings or go to your user profile or just click log out. So the idea is that if you click that, it'll register a drop-down menu, which is basically this exact same logic. Obviously, the component would be a little bit different, but the idea is the exact same. We would need to have some Boolean value to check if it's open or not. And then if it is, we want to render something. If it's not, we can just render nothing. Now that we have working code here, we can actually make a very quick improvement to the code we already have. The ternary operator with the question mark and colon that we have here works completely fine, but there's actually a more succinct way to write it using React-specific notation. It avoids having to specify an empty div tag, and it just looks a bit cleaner overall, in my opinion. So instead of using the ternary operator, we could actually just replace this question mark here with a double ampersand, or the and symbols I like to call it. And then after doing that, we could just delete everything after this column here. So we just go ahead and just delete this like that. And then if we were to go ahead and save it, the code works the exact same as it did before, but we've just written a little less code. And we also don't need to actually write show item equals true like this, because if we just write show item by itself and it's a boolean, it'll know what we mean when the page runs. So I can actually just delete this equals true, and again, just save it, and then the code would run exactly the same as before. And now we're doing the exact same thing we were just doing a moment ago, but with about half the code in a single line. We made it a lot more succinct, and it looks quite a bit better, which just makes it a little bit nicer to read. So basically all this notation is doing with React is if this value is true here, whatever is in the left-hand side of the ampersand symbols, then we display whatever is on the right-hand side of the ampersand symbols, otherwise just display nothing. This is almost always the way that I choose to do conditional rendering with React. It's easy to remember just doing a double and symbol, and it's shorter than the writing the ternary operator altogether, so I find it to be quite nice. Let's quickly summarize everything that's happening in this program in case you got lost anywhere along the way. So inside of our app.js component, which we're already in, we're defining a piece of state here called show item, and we have a setter function called set show item. And then we are setting it to false by default. And then we are taking this state that we made here, and then we are passing it down into our button component, and we're just calling the props show and set show. That way, if we go to our button component, we can just call show right here and set show right here. And it will modify the state of its parent component, which is app.jsx. And then after that, all we're doing is writing a conditional statement down here to check whether or not show is true or false, or whether show item, is true or false. If it's true, we display store item, and then if it's not, we don't display anything. Hopefully that line of reasoning makes sense. If it doesn't, you can go back in the video and rewatch certain parts, or leave a comment and I can try and clarify this for you. One last thing before we wrap up here. Like I just said, this is typically always the way I do conditional rendering with React. However, I know that some people don't like having to write inline code inside JSX, and would rather just write an if-else statement somewhere else to handle the conditional rendering. And I'll show you how to do that real quick if that's kind of the route that you want to take. So let's go up here. Let's make a new function. Let's just say function, we'll call it handle show for right now. And actually, I'm going to capitalize the H here because I'm actually going to make this a component itself. So let's just give it a prop for right now. Let's call it show like this. And then we'll do our curly brackets like this. So we're actually writing a component inside of a component here. And then inside of this, all we need to do is write an if-else statement. So I can write if show, meaning if show is true, then all I want to do is return some JSX because this is a component, and I'll return store item where we're passing in item is equal to, item 1 like this. So this line here saying if show is true, return store item is literally the exact same code that we're doing down here, but this is just showing you putting the functionality inside of its own separate function instead of writing it inside of the JSX itself. Then all we need to do to access this functionality would be to delete our current conditional statement here that we're doing, and then all we would need to do, and actually we don't need color brackets here because we're doing a component instead of just JavaScript code. We just need to type handle show like this. And then we'll need to pass in the show prop that we have up here because we have a prop that we defined. So let's pass in a show prop, and let's just set it equal to our show item piece of state. So we'll just go ahead and pass that in. Now if we go ahead and save this page, the button again works the exact same as before. So all I've basically done now is given you a second way to do conditional rendering by using your own function component to handle the conditional rendering, instead of writing it in line with JSX by using the ternary operator or by using the double and symbol operator. And again, I prefer doing it inline using the double and operator I showed you a moment ago, but if you prefer this method and like writing it kind of out in your own function, then by all means, go for it. And with that, we'll officially wrap up this video. In this video, you learned how to render out lists in React in order to display multiple pieces of information. You also learn how to render certain components or pieces of data based on a condition, which is known as conditional rendering. In the very next episode, we'll go over React Router, which allows you to build apps that are multiple pages and allows you to navigate between each page. I will see you in the next one. Hey everyone, and welcome back to the React series for beginners. In this episode, we're going to go over building multiple pages in a single React application. This isn't the 90s anymore, so practically every modern web application is going to have multiple pages that users can navigate between. This allows you to actually expand your React knowledge to create a full-fledged web app that has multiple pages and many moving parts. To make multiple pages and route between them, we're going to use something called React Router. React Router is a React library that just gives us a router component that we can use to build routes between different pages, but all within the same application. Let's go ahead and get started. Before we do anything, we need to install this React Router library into our program because it doesn't come with React by default. So to do this, let's go ahead and open up a new terminal, which we can go here, this plus button in our terminal. Let's just open it and it'll open up a brand new terminal. And then inside this terminal, let's just type npm I react-router-dom. Exactly like that. npm is just the node package manager we're using to handle packages. I stands for install, and React Router DOM is a library we're grabbing React Router from. So we'll go ahead and just press enter and make sure this runs. To start, let's navigate to our app.jsx file, which we're already in here, where our main code lies. Right now, we just have our leftover code from our previous episode. Here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to make a new folder in src called pages, and I'll make another one called components. This way we can organize which JSX files are full on pages and which JSX files are just components. So to do that, I'll just go in here, new folder. Let's just call one folder components, and then let's make another folder, and let's just call it pages as such. So what I'm going to do is take all the JSX files that are currently components. I'm just going to cut and paste them into our components folder here. So we have, for instance, buttons a component. I'm going to control X and then control V in here. And I'll do the same thing for the other ones. So we have button sections, also a component. Let's cut and paste that one in there. And then we'll do store item, text block, and then we will get text blocks. And now all of the actual smaller components we have should be inside this components folder. And normally I would just like control X these all at the same time, but I noticed sometimes if you try and like cut and paste all at once, it messes up the import lines on top of the files, so I just do them one at a time. And now that we've put away our components into this components folder, the only files we're left with are app.jsx, main.jsx, and then the two corresponding CSS files for them. Now I went over earlier that main.jsx is just the entry point for React, and it's where React actually renders the app. And then app.jsx represents the application itself. Right now, app.jsx is basically like a page for us, but since we're wanting to make a multi-page application, we should instead treat app.jsx as if it's the place that houses all of our pages. I'll show you what I mean by that in just a moment. First, let's make a couple of pages inside of our actual pages folder here. So I'm going to make one, I'm just going to call it home.jsx, and then I'm going to make, let's say page 1, page 2, and page 3. So we'll do page 1.jsx, we will do page 2.jsx, and then we will also do page 3.jsx. And keep in mind, even though we're putting these in their own pages folder, these are still actually React components themselves. They're just going to be our parent components that have many smaller components inside of them. Normally, you'd want to be more descriptive with your page names, but for now, we're just going to do page 1, page 2, and page 3, just to make it easy for you to show. Off camera real quick, I'm going to make some super basic pages that just have some simple JSX tags in them. Okay, so I've just quickly filled out each of these pages. And as you can see here, all I'm doing on each of these pages is just returning a header tag that says which page it is. So home pages, this is home page, this is page 1, this is page 2, and this is page 3. So it's just super simple JSX. Now let's go ahead and navigate to our app.jsx file. And we have all of our leftover code from the previous episode, but I actually don't want to use this right now. So I'm going to take literally everything in this file, and I'm just going to cut and paste this into page 3 for right now. So I'm going to actually delete this here, do it like this, make some tabs here. And then now we'll have everything that we had in the app file. We're just shoving it onto page 3 for now, just to make room in our app. And before we do anything else, let's make sure to take the imports that we're using from app as well and put them on this page. So let's go ahead and import like use state, for instance, from React. And then we need to import, I believe, button and then store item. So we do import button. And then we just want to do import store item like this. Let's go ahead and save this. And let's go ahead and go back into our app file now. And then now just to clean this file up, let's actually go up here and let's delete every single import we have besides the actual CSS file. So we're basically completely emptying this file out to make room for the routes we're about to build. Now let's do what we came here to do and actually build our routes with our pages. So let's import what we need first. So the first thing we want to do is import the hash router from React Router DOM. So I'm going to write import hash router, and it should pop up right here. Press enter, and it'll automatically import hash router from React Router DOM. And then I actually want to import two more things from the same exact library. So I'm just going to use commas. I want to import routes, and I want to import route like this. And just so we don't have to specify hash router every single time, I actually am going to say as router here. That way, this will be an alias for hash router, just so we can type router out. Now, because each of these imports are from a React library, we can treat them as components when we use them. And real quick, I'm just going to go ahead and make more room here, just expand this. So here's what each of these actually does. Hash router, which we are calling router, is the component that we need to wrap our entire app in. And its purpose is to create the routing environment. Routes here, this argument here, is a component where we can specify all the potential routes of our router. And then lastly, route here is the component we use for each individual page, which we can wrap within our routes component. If that sounds confusing, let's make it clear by actually implementing it in our code. The first thing we need to do in our app component is just specify the return function because we deleted it a second ago. Let's just go ahead and write return like this. And then the next step is to write our router component. So to do that, we will just write router like this, and then it'll autofill the closing tag. And then inside of our router component here, all we want to do is write routes like this. And again, it'll autofill the closing tag. So now we have router, and then inside of that, we have routes. Next comes our individual routes that we can specify. So for each route, we need to make a new route component using this route component here. So to make our first route, let's just go ahead and write route like this, and make sure we're not having like an opening and a closing tag. We just have like a singular route tag here. So we make sure we have this / and then this here. So there's two arguments or props that we need to pass into each one of these route components. The first one is path, which just specifies the URL path. And the second is element, which is just the page you want to render that URL path. So first, let's specify the path. So as a prop, just like any other prop, we're going to pass in like this. And we're going to say path equals. And then for right now, we actually just want to do, let's just do a single / like this. This is because by default, you always want to have a path that has this path in it, because that's the default path that your app will go to when it is launched. We'll look more deeply at how the paths work in just a moment. So next, let's pass in our element path for this. Let's go ahead and do element, and then we'll do curly brackets here. And then here, since the route is going to specify our default path, or our home path basically, let's render our home page. Before we do that, we need to import all of our pages into this app.jsx file. So to import all of our pages, let's just go up to the top here, make some space, and I'm going to import each one of the pages that we have inside of our pages folder. So I'm going to import home, should autofill, and all of these should autofill here really easily. Import page 1, and then we'll just do import page 2, and then lastly, we're going to import page 3 like this. Now inside this element prop that we have here for our route, we actually want to pass in a component. So for this one, let's just pass in our home component. To do that, we would just type it like we would any other time rendering a component. So we would just type it like this. Now what this says is at the route of / here, or the path of /, we want to render the component home, which we've made its own page. If we save this, and we go ahead and save it here, now we are displaying our home page because this is the default route. To expand on this, let's go ahead and take this line here, let's copy it, and then let's paste it 3 more times. So now we have a total of 4 routes. And then let's change each of these paths and elements to render each one of our pages specifically. So for this one, we'll have this path be page 1, we'll have this path be page 2, and we'll have this path be page 3. And then we also want to render in each page corresponding to the path. So we'll do page 1 here is rendering this page. On path 2, we are rendering page 2. And then on this path to page 3, we are also rendering page 3. And then we can just go ahead and save this now. So now we've just created routes for each one of our pages. This first route here is our default route because we just use 1 / for the path. And here we're rendering the home page. This second route here that we have is for page 1. And here we render the page 1 page. And the same goes for the other 2 here. So let me show you now how this path prop actually works and how we can use it to navigate between pages. If we go over onto our site here and look at the actual URL up top left here, you can see that we have the URL, which is just the local address that we're hosting this app on. Because that's just the base URL, we're just rendering the home page right now. In the production environment, hash router here that we're using actually automatically adds a /# key here. So I'm actually going to go ahead and just add that like this so that we have this ready to go. Now, because we have our path set up, we can actually just type any one of these paths we want in this URL to navigate to any of our pages. So for right now, let's do /page1 like this. Press enter, and you can see now we're looking at page 1. And because this says this is page 1, that is what we have inside of our actual page 1 component. So then let's look at, let's say page 2, for instance. I can go like this, and I can go page 2, or I could go, for instance, go here and go page 3. So basically, every single time we want to navigate to a certain path, it just needs to be equal to that in the URL. Because right here, we're typing /page 3 to get to page 3. And that's because we set up, let's go to app.jsx here, because we set up the path to render page 3 as /page 3 as so. The same logic works for /page 1 because we specified that when we say /page 1 here, we want to render the page 1. So that's basically all this is saying. And then if we just go ahead and go back to page 3 really quick, you can see that this is the same stuff that was originally on our app.jsx file, because remember, we just cut and pasted all the stuff from app into our page 3 here, hence why this is originally what we were doing. So let's go ahead and navigate back to our home page. So I'm just going to go ahead and delete this /page 3 here, and now we are back to our home page. So now that we know that our navigation works, but you're probably thinking, wow, that's great and all, but nobody's ever going to type in the URL of the page they want to navigate to. Obviously, it would be ideal if we had buttons and links on our page that can navigate to other pages. So let's go ahead and add that in. React Router DOM, the exact same library we actually use to make our routes, has a super nice component called link that can easily link pages together. Let's add some links in just our home page for right now. So let's go ahead and navigate to home.jsx. And at the very top of this file, I just want to import that link out component I was just talking about. So I'm going to write import link, and then it'll say from React Router DOM. We'll just go ahead and autofill that and press enter. And now let's make links to each of our pages. To make a link to another page, all we need to do is render this link as a component here. So to do that, let's just go under our heading here, and let's just type link like this, and then it'll go ahead and autofill the closing tag. In between the tags, we can type the text we want the link to say. For this first link, we will just go ahead and write home right here. Then to specify where we want the link to go, we can add a to prop inside of our opening tag like this. We can specify a prop here. To make this to prop work, we can enter in a path here, and you want to make sure the path matches the actual path perfectly inside of our route. So for instance, in our app.jsx, we notice the path for our home page is just this / by itself. So if we want to make a link that goes to that path, we need to make sure it just matches exactly. So it would look like this, where we just have to equals, and we would do a string of /. And then let's take this and let's actually make links to all of our other pages too. So I'm going to do this, this, and this, and then we'll make links for all our pages. So I'll say path 1, path 2, I'll say path 3, and then obviously we'll change the text in here. I'll say path 1, path 2, and then path 3. And now I can go ahead and save it, and we have links to each one of our pages. Oh, and actually real quick, let me change these. I meant to do page 1 and not path here. So I'll do page 2, page 3, and then we'll change these to pages. Changes to pages. Let's go ahead and resave it. Okay, so now it looks a little better. Even though it's still an ugly blob of links here, we have home, page 1, page 2, and page 3. And these are all links to each one of our respective pages. So if we click the home page, for instance, nothing actually happens because, spoiler, we actually are on the home page right now. So it makes sense that nothing happened. But we can click page 1, and now we go to page 1. Go back to this page, click on page 2, we go to page 2, and now we can click on page 3 and then go to page 3. So that is how the link component works with React Router DOM. Now you're probably thinking, well, that's great and all, but it doesn't really help that we only have links on one of our pages, being the home page. Because that means to navigate to any of the other pages with link, we need to be on the home page. Because for instance, if we're on page 2, we no longer have the links down here. So that's a little bit inconvenient. Now there's a couple of solutions to fix this. The first one, and probably the most obvious, is that we could just copy and paste this link code here that we have into every single page, so that every single page had the exact same links. This would work, but it's not efficient to have a bunch of copied code everywhere. Instead, what we should do is build a navbar. A navbar is what you see on almost every website at the top or left side of the screen. Basically just a menu where you can click buttons that take you to separate pages. This is a lot better than copying and pasting links onto each page. To do that, it's a little bit more complex than what we've gone over so far, but it's not too much extra work, so let's go ahead and get started on it. The first thing I want to do is go ahead and just make a new navbar component. So in our components folder here, I'm just going to make a new file. I'm going to call it navbar.jsx like this. And then inside, like any other component, we'll just go ahead and write export function navbar like this. And then inside, we'll do a return statement of just empty tags for right now. And then let's take the code we wrote for our links here on our homepage. Let's take this here, and let's go ahead and cut it, and then go back into our navbar, and let's paste it inside of here. And then just so we don't actually get any errors, let's make sure we import the link, because we're going to need that. So import link from React Router DOM. And real quick, off camera, I'm going to add buttons to all of these to make it look a little bit nicer in terms of formatting. Okay, so all I did was just go ahead and make buttons inside each of these links here, just so it's formatted a little bit nicer. Now that we've done this, we've got a completely functional navbar. So how do we implement this navbar now into our code? Well, this is where things get just a little bit tricky. A navbar should be present on every single page that we have, but you don't want to have to render this navbar component into every page by copy and pasting it, because if we have many pages, this just becomes unmanageable. Navbar should exist outside of the page routes so that it renders only once as its own component and doesn't get altered by switching pages. So how can we do that? Here's what we can do, and I'll go ahead and just walk you through it. The way I usually do it goes like this. I usually make a file that I just call layout.jsx like this. This will be our own component. For now, I'm just putting it in the root source directory. And then inside of this, I'll just make it as a component. We'll do export function layout like this. And then we'll just go ahead and do like a simple return for now, just like this. And then what we want to do is import the navbar that we just created. So let's import navbar. It should autofill like that. And then I want to import one more thing from React Router DOM called outlet. So I'll go ahead and import this outlet, and I'll explain what this does in just a second. And then inside this layout component, let's go ahead and render our navbar first as a component. And then let's just make a main tag here. And then inside of this, we're going to render the outlet tag that we just made. So I've done all this kind of fast. Now let me explain actually how all of this works. So we made a layout component, and inside of it, we are first rendering our navbar that we just created a moment ago. And this will actually show our navbar to the user. What makes the real magic happen is this outlet tag down here. What outlet does is basically just renders all the child routes of whatever route this layout is in. So what that means is that we can put layout as a parent route to the rest of the routes. And then all of our pages that we have, like home, page 1, page 2, page 3, will all just be children to this layout. This outlet is dynamic and will become whatever routes are under it. So in our case, this outlet will become all of our other routes. This allows for the navbar to exist outside of the other routes, hence why we are rendering it on its own right here. Let me show you how to implement this now into our app.jsx routes if it's still kind of confusing. We only need to make one simple change in our app.jsx file to just make this work. So let's first import the layout component that we just made. So let's import layout, autofill, and we'll import it like this. And then what we need to do is make another route down here, but we want to make sure it has an opening and a closing tag this time. So let's make a route like this. And then what we want to do, let's make space here. And then I'm going to take all these old routes here. I'm just going to cut them, and I'm going to paste them inside here like this. And then lastly, let's take this here. Let's make an element prop here. And for the element prop, we just want to pass in the layout component we just made like this. Let me explain how this works. As you can see, we wrapped all of our previous routes inside this singular route tag here. That is just rendering layout. So all of these routes that we have here are now child routes of this layout route up top. So what this means is that if we go to our actual layout component here, this layout component is rendering navbar up top, right? And then right here, we are rendering outlet. We just saw that the child routes to this layout component are equal to all of these 4, meaning that in this layout component, all those 4 routes now become this outlet component here, meaning that outlet now will just render all 4 of those routes. And the reason why we do this is because now the navbar exists outside of the other 4 routes that we have. So now let's go ahead and let's just save this file here. Let's save app.jsx. And then let's go ahead and go into navbar and save that as well. We'll just make sure everything is saved here. Let's go save all. And then now you can see we have 4 buttons here, one for each one of our pages. And each one of these buttons is coming from our navbar component here, because each one of these is a link, and then each one of the links we have a button that corresponds to each page. Now I can click any one of these 4 buttons, which all come from our navbar component, and it'll take us to any of the pages that we want. So I can click on page 1, it'll take us to page 1. I can click page 2, it'll take us to page 3. I can click on page 3, and it'll take us to page 3. So I didn't copy and paste these links to every single one of our pages. So we know for certain that this navbar we have here right now exists outside of our page routes. And now we've got a fully functioning navigation system with multiple routes that lead to multiple pages. Now that all the setup is done, we can add, remove, and edit different pages however we want. Let's say I want to add a new page now and just call it page 4. I can go here, I can say page4.jsx, and then I'll make a new component. I'll just say export function page 4. And then I'll just return tags here. And inside of this, I'll just make a header that says this is page 4 like this. Go ahead and save it. And then once I have this page created that I want to add, all I need to do is edit two files, app.jsx and then navbar.jsx. In app.jsx, all I need to do is import this page that we just made. And then I could just make a new route for it down here. So I could just go routes. Actually, I'll just copy and paste this so it's faster. Just like any other route we have, I could copy and paste this, make this route or path page 4, and then make the element we're rendering equal to page 4. And then the last thing we would need to do is just go ahead and go to our navbar here, and let's add another link for the page we just created. So we can go here, go like this, page 4, and then page 4 like this, save it, and now we've added something on our navbar to go to page 4. If we click it, we go to this page 4 component we have just made. So now we have just successfully added a page to our site. This process would be the same for any time we wanted to add a page. All we need to do is actually write the page itself, what we've done here. We need to import it into our app and then add it as a route. And then we would just need to alter our navbar to have that button be showing for that page. If we wanted to remove pages, the process is just the opposite of what we just did. We would just need to delete the route from our app.jsx file. So for instance, if we want to get rid of page 4, we could just delete this line here. And then we would just go into our navbar and then delete it from here as well. And then we would have successfully just deleted a page basically. And if we want to edit any of the pages, now we can just go to any of our pages folder, access any of the files we want, and then edit them however we like. For example, if on page 1 here, we go to page 1, we don't like how this looks. We want to say this is the very first page. Go and delete this here, save it, and we've now modified the very first page. So any edits you want to make, you can just do inside the pages themselves, just like we would before with any other component. And with that, we're going to wrap up today's episode. In this episode, you learned how to use React Router to make multi-page web applications. You learned how to craft different pages, import and render them into app.jsx, and you learned how to navigate between pages using a custom-made navbar that exists outside of all the other pages. In the very next episode, we'll combine everything we've learned so far into a sample project. We'll build a basic web application from scratch using everything we know. I will see you in the next one. Hey everyone, and welcome to the final episode in our React for Beginners series. Throughout this course, you learned all the basics behind React, and in this episode, we're going to build an example project in React. The site we're going to build is going to be a simple shop website. It'll have a home page, a products page, an about us page, and a contact page. So let's get right into it. The first thing we need to do is set up our React project. We need to make sure we've installed Node.js before we do this. If you already installed it in the previous episodes like I did, we can move forward to the next step. So let's go into Visual Studio Code. Let's go ahead and go to View up here and open up our terminal. And once we have our terminal open, let's make sure we get into the right directory that we want to go to. So in my computer, I'm going to cd into my source folder, and then I'm going to cd into my repos folder, and then now I'm in the correct directory that I want to use. Once we are in the right directory that we want, let's go ahead and run this command. Let's run npm create vite at latest, which will just create a React app using Vite, which will use the latest version of Vite. So let's go ahead and just press enter here. And then once we run it, it'll ask us just a couple of questions that we want. So it's going to ask us for a project name. For this, let's just do, let's say React Store for this. And then it asks for a framework. Go down to React, press enter. Obviously, it's the React course. And then for our language, let's just choose default JavaScript. And then now it should be completely done. And it gives us a few commands to follow. It says to do cd into the directory, npm install, and then npm run dev. So let's go ahead and do those real quick. Let's first cd into our React store. So run this command. We'll say cd React store like this. Now we're in there. And then let's just go ahead and open the folder here just so we have it. So let's go ahead and go into whatever folder you're going to use. I have like source and then repos. And then I made one called React store. So we're going to select that folder. And then it should completely open it up here. And then we'll go ahead and just reopen our terminal by just going to view and then clicking terminal like this. Then I want to go ahead and run npm install to install all the packages that we're going to need for this program. So I'll run this and it'll take a second. And then lastly, to actually get our site launched, we can just go ahead and run the command npm run dev in our terminal, press enter, and it should generate a link for us so we can use it for our local host. So hold down control, click it, and it should open up a tab here that has our new project just created. And I'm actually going to go ahead and take these screens here, split the screens here a little bit, and then just shift it over a little bit. So now we have our Visual Studio in one side of the screen, and then our actual app on the other side of the screen. And as always, just looking at our directory real quick, we know that all of our packages and dependencies are in this node modules folder. So it's going to be this huge giant folder of a bunch of stuff that we don't really need to worry about for the moment. And then we know that all of our actual code for our app is inside this src or source directory. And the main files we're concerned about right now are app.jsx and main.jsx. Like always, when we create a project with Vite, main.jsx here will be the entry point for our code. It's the file that actually renders the React DOM, and inside of the React render statement, we render app.jsx, which is just represented by this app component here that we have imported from app.jsx. If we go into our app.jsx file, it looks something like this. Everything we see on this web page right here is coming from this app.jsx file. We have the React logo, we have the Vite logo, and then we just have some text telling us some information. Because we're not going to be using any of this, let's just actually go ahead and look at the return statement in our app.jsx here. And let's go ahead and actually just delete all of this, just clear it out for right now. And then we'll just make, let's finish this tag here. So we have an empty tag here. So if we save it, now we're just returning nothing. So we have a clean slate. Now we have the project set up, let's review the steps we need to make our shop website. We said we wanted 4 pages, a home page, a products page, about us page, and a contact page. So I'm going to make a new folder in our source directory here, and I'm just going to go ahead and call it pages. And then inside here, I'm just going to make a new JSX file for each page that we want to have on our site. So I'll make one called home.jsx, one called products.jsx, and then one called contact.jsx. Okay, so all I've done off camera is just made 4 new files. I have an about us page, a contact us page, home page, and products page. In each of these pages, all I've done is just made a super basic React component where all I'm returning is just a header saying what page it is so we can identify it. So in the about page, just a header saying about us page. Contact, it just says contact page. We have this for the home page, and then we have this for the products page. Now let's quickly make a new folder in our source directory again. Let's call it components. So we're basically going to separate out our full pages with our smaller components. That's how we're going to separate out this organization here. So we're going to make this new components folder here. And the first component that I'm thinking of that we want to make for this site is going to be a nav bar. This way, users can navigate between all the different pages we have, so it can go, for example, from home to about, or from contact to products, or any other combination of routes. So let's go ahead and make a file in here, and let's just do navbar.jsx. And then for right now, we're just going to do what we did for the other components and just make them super simple. We'll say export function navbar like this. And then we're going to return just something empty for right now. And actually, just for the time being, just so we can see it, I'm going to make a header tag here that says this is our navbar, just so we can see it whenever it pops up. And then the last thing I want to do for this setup process is make one last component called layout that we're going to use to actually render our navbar in. So I'm going to call it layout.jsx. And then same thing, we'll just make a super simple component now that just returns something that's empty. So I'll say export function layout, and we're going to return just an empty tag for right now. So now we've at least created all the components and the pages that we're going to be using for this site. But first, before we try and flesh these out and fully build them, let's first make the routes that we're going to use between each of our pages. And along with that, let's go ahead and make the navbar as well. So let's start with the routes. So let's just go ahead and go into our terminal here and use this plus button to open up a new terminal. And in here, I want to install the library we're going to use for our routing, which is just React Router DOM. So to do that, I'm going to type npm I React Router DOM like this, and then go ahead and press enter. And once this installs, we should be good to go. Now that we have that, let's go ahead and go into our app.jsx file, and let's actually build out the routes that we need. And actually, I forgot to delete this. Let's just get rid of this too. And then we can get rid of all these imports up here, just so we can make some extra space. We don't have some junk cluttering it up. The first thing we want to do is import the necessary components from React Router DOM. So to do that, let's go to the top of our file here. Let's go ahead and type imports, and we're going to first import hash router, which is going to be use the actual hash router component to make our routing environment. And then we're going to import a few more components here. We're going to say routes, and then routes, and then we're going to rename this hash router to just router for now, just so we can do a little bit less typing for it. I'll go over these things a little bit, but if you want a deeper explanation of what these things are and what exactly they're used for, you may want to check out the previous episode, which is the one right before this, which is where we went over kind of what these things are used for. But otherwise, let's go ahead and start building. The first thing we want to do in our app.jsx return statement here is make sure we have a router, which is this, wrapping all of our code. So let's go ahead and delete these here. And let's just make router like this, make the opening tag, and it'll autofill the closing tag. So we're going to go ahead and just space it out like this. And then inside this router tag here, we want to add another tag called routes, which we also imported from React Router DOM. We'll do another opening and closing tag here. So you should now have router component, and within that you should have a routes component. And underneath this routes component is where you normally would just specify the individual routes that you want in your program. However, we're going to be using a navbar in our program because we're building a shop website, so we're doing things just a little bit differently. So the first thing we want to do is create a route for our overall site layout, so that we can make the navbar exist outside of the other routes so that it appears on every page and isn't changed by the routes at all. To do this, before we define anything in our app.jsx file, let's actually go to our layout.jsx component and actually build the layout that we want for our site, which includes rendering the navbar and all the child routes that are underneath it. So to do this, let's first import the navbar that we just created in our components folder. So we'll import navbar like this, should autofill, and we'll import it like that. Then we want to import one more thing. We want to import outlet as well from React Router DOM. Once we have these two things imported, we're clear to make our layout file. All we need to do in our return is render the navbar first. So let's go ahead and go here. Let's go ahead and render navbar like this. And then underneath it, I'm going to make a main tag. And this doesn't actually do anything functionality-wise. This just makes it a little bit easier for organization when you're using the console to inspect your site. And then under here, only thing I need to do left is render the outlet component just like this. I explained how this outlet worked in a lot more detail last episode. However, a super quick explanation if you're not caught up is that this outlet basically acts as a dynamic component that will render a bunch of child routes. So if we have this layout component that we have here as a parent route, we'll render the navbar on its own, and then all of the other routes get rendered under this outlet. So this way the navbar exists on its own and not inside the main routing scheme. And now that we have this layout file created just the way we want it, we can go back into our app.jsx file and actually now make our routes. So first let's import all the pages we're going to be using. So let's go up here to the top, make sure we can make space here. Let's go ahead and import, let's say site layout first. So I just have layouts, and then let's import all the other pages that we're going to be using. So we'll go ahead and import. We don't need to do navbar for right now since we already have that in layout, but we need to do the other pages like about, and then like contact, home, and product. So we'll say import contact. We will say import home, and then lastly we will say import products, just like that. Now we have all the pages and components imported that we're going to be using in this app.jsx file to set up our routing scheme. And now that we have these pages, we can now plug them into our routes that we're going to be making down here. So let's make the first route. So we'll make our route opening and closing tag by just writing route like this. And then this is going to be the route that is going to encompass our site layout component, which is going to be the parent route. So let's go ahead and specify our element here that we want to render for this route. And we just want to render our site layout just like this. And now that we've got the actual router that's making the route within our pages, we're specifying routes here. And now we've got a parent route that will render the navbar on its own along with the child routes. Now we can actually specify the routes we want to use for each of our pages like about us, contact, home, and products. So let's now make a route for each one of these pages. So firstly, let's make a route for, let's say the home page first. And with these routes, we want to pass in two props. We want to have a path prop and an element prop. The path prop is going to be basically what the URL of the path is, and the element prop is going to be the component that we want to render at that URL. So we always want to have a base route, which is just going to mean a path of just slash. So basically like an empty URL. That will always be our home page or a default page. And because we're doing this as a default page, it would probably make the most sense to render our home page with this. So let's go ahead and do elements equals, and then we want to render our home page components. And then all I'm going to do here is just copy and paste this a couple times just so we can make routes for other pages. So we have home page as the default route. And then let's say next we want to have our products page. And then after that, we want to have, let's say, about us. And then actually I'll do about us as one word here. Actually, no, I'll just do about. And then I will do contact. And then we'll change these elements accordingly so that they match the paths that we're rendering. So we'll say elements equals about here because we've rendered in about here. This one should be products. And then this one here should be contact. So now all we've done is basically created a route for each one of these 4 pages that we have in this folder. The path for the home page is just the /, which means no URL, so it's the default path. And we're just rendering our home page component here. For our products path, we are rendering in products and so forth for each one of these pages. So to go ahead and test what we have, let's actually go up here and let's go save all. And now you can see we have on our page a text that says, this is our navbar and then home page. And this makes sense that we're rendering our home page because this is the default route with no URL, meaning if there's no URL specified up here, it's just going to default to whatever route we have right here with just a / for the path. Now, it also makes sense that we are rendering our navbar. So as I said, the reason we make this layout folder is so we can make the navbar exist outside of the other routes. So therefore, no matter what page we're on, it's always going to say this is our navbar, and then this text will change depending on whatever page we're on. Obviously, I'm on a home page and it says home page. If I was on the About Us page, this text would say About Us page here, but this navbar would remain the same because we want our navbar to exist on its own. And actually now, since we have our navbar set up, we would like to actually make our navbar useful and not just say this is our navbar. So let's go into this navbar.jsx file. Let's make it look a little bit prettier. So let's go ahead and import the link component from React Router DOM, which is the component that allows us to basically use buttons to route between different pages. So basically, when I click a button that has a link in it, it'll link to some other page on our website. So I'm going to go ahead and import link from React Router DOM. And then all we want to do in here is basically just make links for each one of our pages. So I'm going to write link like this. I'm going to copy and paste it 3 more times because we have 4 different pages in total. And then let's just say for the text in each one, we want to pass in whatever we want the text to be as says, like, or I guess whatever the link says itself. So let's say home for one button. Let's say products, and then about us. And then of course we will have contact us. And then for our link property, all we need to do is make a toProp that matches exactly whatever the path of the page is here. So if I want to go to this home page here, I need to make sure when I pass in the toProp, it matches this path here. So just the /. So basically, if I want to go to the home page, I need to do /. If I want to go to the products page, I need to do /products like this. If I want to go to the About Us page, I just need to do /about. And then if I want to go to the Contact Us page, I can just do /contact. And now if we look at this, you can see that these paths here all match exactly the name of the paths in this app.jsx file. And now that we've saved our site, you can see we now have working links on our homepage here. And actually, to go ahead and make this look a little bit less ugly, I'm going to add a button component in each one of these things here. Oops, typo. So I'm going to add button like this. I'm going to put each one of these inside of a button just so it doesn't look so bad and it's not just like raw text. And they actually are inside of like a organized button. So just keep doing this for all these. Let's get this in here. And then let's go ahead and get this last one in here. And then if we go ahead and just save this, now it looks a little bit nicer. Now we have each of our links inside of its own little button. Now that we have these buttons here, let's actually test out how they work. So we can click on home page here. Nothing happens because we're already on the home page. I can click on products, we go to the products page. About us, we go to the About Us page. And contact us, we go to the contacts page. So we can see that our navbar is clearly working because when we click on these buttons, we go to the corresponding page. So we know it is working properly. Now, normally navbar components aren't in the middle of the page like this. They're normally at like the top of the screen, like the very top, like vertically. So let's quickly make some CSS to make our navbar component look a little bit prettier and actually format it in the correct spot. Okay, so I went ahead and added a little bit of CSS off screen. I made a navbar.css file in which I just made a navbar property and a navbutton property. For the navbar itself, I said a couple of things to get it to the top of the screen and centered. And I just made the background color of it teal and gave it a little bit of rounded edges for it. And then for the nav button CSS, I just made the background color black. Now, how I actually implemented the CSS in our file is if you look at this navbar file now, you can see that we use this class name equals navbar. That is referencing this navbar property right here. And then in this, on each of these buttons here, we have class name equals nav button. So basically every single button is styled with this nav button, which just makes every button have a background color of black. And like always, if we're importing a CSS file or importing any file, we make sure to do it at the top here. Also, if we didn't have this file here and it didn't work and we just saved it, then we have no styling. So we need to make sure we're importing the file, save it, and now we have all sorts of CSS styling that makes the navbar a little bit easier to look at and a little bit easier to use. Now that we've got all of our routes created and we have an actual functional and nice looking nav bar, we're good to start building out each one of our pages, which will make up the bulk of this project. I mentioned we wanted to build a store. We haven't specified what kind of store yet. Let's say for the sake of this web app that we're building right now, we're going to build a page that sells gym supplements. So let's go ahead and start building out each one of our pages and envisioning kind of what they should look like. And we'll start with the home page. So let's navigate to our home.jsx file. So this is a course intended to teach you React and not necessarily to teach you CSS. So I'm not going to focus super hard on styling these pages. So they might look a little bit ugly because it's not going to be a fully fleshed out website. So these pages here with home, about us, contact, and products might not look super great. But again, the point is just to show you the React functionality. So let's go ahead and go on our home page here and make a couple of tags just to style it up. Let's just add a super basic heading tag. When you first get on the home page, that just says, welcome to our website. And for now, we're saying we're a gym supplement store. Let's just say, or I have a super generic name. Let's say, welcome to gym supplement store, like this. Yep. And then we'll just do that for our first heading. And then on top of this, all I want to do is add an image tag on here to show an image on our home page. So I'm just going to add img like this. I'm just going to pass in a source element for now. We haven't had the images picked out yet, but we'll go ahead and put that in just a second. And then we will also add, let's add a link to our products page with a button that just says like view all products. So I'll go ahead and import link here from React Router DOM. And then let's make a link component here. So let's do that like this. And then inside the link, let's just make a button just for our products. And it'll just say view all products. And then, of course, if we're going to view all products, we would like to have this link go to the products page. So we're going to make the path equal to /products as such. Go ahead and save it. And we don't have any image yet because we don't have any source. But let's go ahead and find that image now. Okay, so I went ahead and found a super basic, just royalty-free image off of a website here of just this barbell heel that we're just going to put on our home page. So let's take this, and I went ahead and put it in our public folder. This is typically where you see a lot of images stored, like we have our V logo still in here from before. So we'll take barbell.jpg and we put it in this public folder. Now let's go back into our home. Let's actually import that image. So let's say imports, let's just call it, let's say barbell image. And then we're going to import it from, and you want to make sure we access this public folder here. If we do a .. on the import, it'll go back a folder. And then we need to go back one more folder. And then now you'll see this public folder here. Let's go public and then /barbell.jpg. And then now if we actually just want to add this image to our page, inside this image source here, we can actually just do curly brackets to show we're going to write some JavaScript. And we can just write barbell image like this, just making sure that we type it exactly how we import it up here. And now if we go ahead and save this, you'll see it now adds this picture to our home page. And again, this doesn't look super great right now because I don't have any actual CSS for this page. But let's go ahead and just move on to our products page next. So let's go ahead and navigate to our products page here. And for right now, obviously, we just have this products page header because we have it right here. So for our products page, here's what I was thinking. I was thinking we could have, let's say, 3 products just to start off with. We'll have, let's say, since we're a gym supplement store, we can do like creatine, protein powder, and let's say mass gainer or something like that. We'll have each product have a title, like a description, and then a price. And then we'll also have the ability to add the products to your cart if you like. So the first thing I'm actually going to do is make all 3 of our products, and I'm actually going to make them as objects. And there'll be quite a bit of typing here, so I'm going to go ahead and skip ahead and just do it off camera, and I'll show you the objects after I'm done writing them. Okay, so I went ahead and made our 3 products here. I'm going to go ahead and just scoot this over again. So we have this here. A little bit less, actually. Okay, so for our products, I'll just walk you through them real quick. So we have 3 things. We have protein, we have creatine, and we have mass gainer. So for instance, for this first one, we have a title of protein powder, description of whey protein powder used for building muscle. And then on the price, we have a price of 40, and we're assuming $40 US in this case. And then for the other ones, we also have titles and descriptions as well. Basically, for each object, we have just given it 3 fields, title, description, and price that we will use to display on our website. Now here, it's definitely worth noting that if you're running an actual online store, you're probably going to have a database somewhere that actually stores your products. You're not just going to hard code them into your site like this. So that's a thing for another video, but for now, we are just hard coding them into the site. So next thing I want to do is just go ahead and make an array that just has these 3 objects in them. So to do that, we will just write an array. We'll call it products. We'll say const products, and then we're just going to fill in these products that we have to do. So we'll do protein, creatine, and mass gainer. So now we have all three of our actual objects in this products array now. Now let's learn what we used in the previous episodes to actually list out this array here and display some component for each product. So we can use what we learned about the map function to actually implement this. So inside of our return statement here, I'm actually going to go ahead and just delete this heading here just to get rid of our products page entirely. I'm going to go ahead and add the curly brackets, and let's go ahead and type out our map function. So just like before, we'll do products.map, and then inside of map, we want to pass in a function. So we'll do parentheses here, and then an arrow function, and then just curly brackets like this. And then for each thing that we're mapping, we want to make sure we are returning some sort of JSX. But right now, I'm just going to do an empty tag like this, just so we're returning nothing for each one. I'll go ahead and save it, and now obviously our page has turned blank because we have deleted the products page header. And then just so we don't forget, I'll go ahead and name our argument inside our function here, product. That way, product is an alias for each product object that we are mapping out of project or products. So for instance, on the first run, product is equal to protein. On the second run, product is equal to creatine. And on the last run, product is equal to mass gainer. So now the question becomes, what do we want to render out for each product? For now, let's just do something super basic. Let's use a header to return each product's title, use a p tag to return each product's description, and then use a button tag to display its price. So to do this, let's just go ahead and here, let's do header 2 for this one, and we can style it later if we want to. And for this one, we are just going to pass in product.title, and then let's do the same for the other ones. We'll do a p tag for the description. We'll say product.desk, and then for the price, let's do a button. And then inside of here, we are just going to pass in product dot, we'll say price like this. And now let's go ahead and save this. And now you can see we have our 3 products actually listed here. And just so we're clear, it's talking about dollars. Let's just pass in this dollar symbol here so that we now have the dollar inside of our price here. And actually, just so we can add an add to cart button on each product, let's go ahead and go below button here. Let's do another button. And in this one, we will just literally say add to cart like this. Go ahead and save it. And now each thing has a thing next to it that says we can add it to our cart. So now the question then becomes, if we're going to have a cart functionality, how do we actually implement having a cart in our program? And I will go over that in just a moment. However, I actually want to do something really quick. So if you look right here, we're returning this these header 2 tags, p, and then buttons for every single product that we're mapping. If we technically want to be a little bit more, I guess, succinct in React, we should technically probably put this out into its own component. We can just name it like something like product card. So let's go into our components here, and let's name it product card.jsx. And let's go in here, and let's just make a function here. And we are literally just going to export what we just wrote for this product just into this one here. So this one should take in one prop, which will just be our product. And that'll be because if you go into the products page here, we just have one element here that is passing in like the title, the description, and the price that represents the actual object here. So because of that, we're just going to have this one product prop here. And then we'll just write our return statement like this. And then all I want to do is literally just take this stuff here. I'm going to cut and paste this. I'm going to cut it, and I'm going to go ahead and just paste it. And it looks like it has the formatting up a little bit. Go ahead and backspace some of these. Let's do Shift Tab, get these back. And then we'll get this back formatted. So now we've literally just copy and pasted the stuff from the other file into here. And then we'll just go ahead and save this now. And now that we have it in its own separate component, we can just go back into products.jsx here. Let's actually import that component now. So let's import product card from the component we just made right here in this file. And then now for each time we're mapping a product, all we need to do is just return a single component because we just made a component in something. So to do that, all we need to do is write product card like this. And then remember, for product card, we need the prop. We're going to need this product prop. But luckily for us, we already have it right here. So that's super convenient. So we'll just do product equals product, as it'll be equal to this product right here. And now if we go ahead and save it, we have the exact same thing we had before, but now we have it in our own little component. So the code looks a lot more succinct and nicer because we've separated it out into this product card component here. This is generally the process you're going to want to use when you have anything that's kind of returning something that's going to be repetitive, or just returning multiple things in general. Having your own component for things is going to make your code look a lot more organized, hence why I think this looks a lot cleaner than just returning the actual headers and like the buttons inside this mapping here. Now that we have this implemented, the question then becomes, how do we add functionality to add stuff to our cart? So ideally, we'd like to be able to click these add to cart buttons here, and then perhaps in our navbar, we can have a little cart button that'll basically say like how many products we have in our cart, and we can actually go to that page and see what is in our cart. So how can we actually implement this? Well, the first thing I'm thinking of is actually adding a carts page. So let's go to our pages here. Let's go to new file. Let's make a page called cart.jsx. And for right now, just like any other function, we're to export function cart. Just do it like this. We're going to return some JSX. And then inside of here, for right now, all I'm going to say is this is the cart page. And we'll go ahead and save this. And then let's actually make a route for it now in our app.jsx. So when we're importing all the other page now, let's import cart as well, just so we're adding a page. And then let's add a route for cart too. So we'll just actually take this line, copy and paste it, and just change it so it is now cart. And the element we want to render is this cart here that we just imported, which is the component we just made. So we'll go ahead and import cart as so. And then lastly, all we need to do to actually get this as a new page is to put it in our navbar as a button. So let's go ahead and add a link for the cart. So let's copy and paste all of this. And then we'll do link to /cart because we want to link to the cart page. And then we will say, let's just put cart inside the button here. And then you can see we have added a cart button up here. And now we've added something that says this is the cart page. So in addition to having our home page, products page, about us, contact us, we now have the cart page here. Now here is where the tricky part comes in. So to actually display the stuff on our cart page, we need to have to be able to communicate with the products page. Because when somebody clicks, let's say, add to cart on the products page, we need to add something basically to the navbar that shows, okay, we have something on our cart, and then we need to actually be able to see it on our cart page. So what that implies is that we're going to need to have some sort of state inside of our app.jsx file that can keep track of this. Now, normally for this kind of thing, I would use like a state management system, something like Redux. Redux is a React state management system that allows you to kind of do this a lot more easier. But for our sake, since we're not doing that, we're just doing base React, we can actually do this through props. So to do this, let's actually import the useState function from React so we can actually make some state in our app.jsx component. And then up here in our app, I'm going to make a new piece of state. I'm just going to say const, let's say cart, and then set cart. And then by default, let's say we want the cart to be an array, right? Because the cart could have multiple things or it could have nothing in it. So we want to be able to at least hold multiple things if it can. So let's just make it an empty array for right now. So that's what it will default to. And then we can't actually really do anything with this cart and set cart in our app.jsx component. So instead what we should probably do is pass these components down as props into the products page and into the cart page. Because ultimately, these are the two pages that need to communicate. Again, if we hit add cart on the products page, it should then reflect and show up on the cart page. So let's go ahead and do exactly that. Let's actually pass in into elements or into products here. Let's go ahead and pass in props here. We'll do a cart prop here. We'll do like that, and then we'll pass in cart. And then we'll also do a prop for set cart, which we will just name the exact same thing, set cart like that. And then let's just copy this. And we actually want to paste it in our cart page as well. So basically, we are adding props for both our products page and our cart page as well. So now let's actually make those props inside of those components. So in products, we now want a cart prop and we want a set cart prop. Let's go ahead and just save this here. And then inside of our cart page, we also want the exact same thing. So we'll say cart and then set cart. So now in both of these files, in both products.jsx and cart.jsx, these cart and set cart here is equal to the props that we're passing in when we're rendering our routes here. So for the products page, we are rendering cart here, which is just equal to this piece of state here. And then we are also passing in set cart, which is equal to this set cart setter function here. So let's actually first look at how we can add products to our cart. So let's go into our products page. And now we obviously have this prop called set cart that we can use to actually add items to our cart now. So the question is, how on our products page do we do this? Because if we look at what we're rendering here in our map, we're actually rendering in a product cart component. So really what we need to be doing is passing this cart and set cart props down as more props into this product cart. So to do that, we'll just do them like any other props. We'll do cart equals cart like this, which is equal to the cart up here. And then we will also do set cart is equal to set cart like this. Now this is where React can get a little bit annoying if you're not using a state management tool like Redux, because if we have multiple layers of components, we're basically having a huge prop chain. Like this cart and the set cart here is equal to the same cart and set cart from the app file, and then we're just passing it down into the products, and from the products page, we're further passing it down into the product card page. So again, this is why a state management system like Redux could be useful. You don't necessarily have to use one if you're willing to put up with kind of the annoyance of passing down a whole train of props. So now that we pass it down into our product card, let's go ahead and go into our product card page. Let's go ahead and add those props we just put in. So we'll do cart and set cart just like this. Now, if we look back at our products page, what we need to happen is once we click this add to cart, we want something to happen. So to do that, we should add an on click event to our add to cart button. So let's go ahead and just go on click here. And then the question becomes, what do we want to do within this function? And what I think we should actually do is make a function in here that's just called handle click. Put a function called handle click here. And then we will just pass in like this. And then in this on click, let's go ahead and put the function definition for that. So we'll do arrow function, and we'll just put in handle click like this. So now let's actually look at handling our handle click function. So what should we do when somebody clicks add to cart? Well, let's think about it. The only thing that we really need to do is actually just to call this set cart function so we can set whatever item we're clicking inside of our cart. So let's actually just call that function. Let's do set cart. And then now, how do we actually set our cart? So let me offer a scenario here. Let's say you have like 3 items already in your cart, and you just want to add a 4th item. Well, to add this 4th item to your cart, you'd like to be able to just append it, right? Because you don't want to wipe out the other 3 items and just replace it with just the 1. So you'd like to be able to append the 4th item onto the already existing 3 items. And we also know that our cart is going to be an array of objects because each product that we have here on this page is technically an object as defined in our products page here. So to actually do what we want to do, we can use a thing called spread notation, which in JavaScript basically just means we are taking an existing object and kind of just copying it over, and we can add stuff to it if we'd like. So to do that, all we need to do is do curly brackets to show that we're talking about an object. And then all we need to do is type ... cart like this, which shows that we're copying the contents from the existing cart. And then if we want to add something to it like this, all we need to do is add whatever product has been clicked. So we'll just add in product as such. So all it is saying is we are setting cart equal to whatever the existing cart is with the addition of the new product. And then let's make one more upgrade to this page. So one thing I want to do is that if somebody clicks the add to cart button, it'd be nice if on the button is switched to added instead of saying add to cart to know that that button actually worked and it has been added to the cart correctly. So to do that, we can actually do something we know as conditional rendering. So let's make some room down here where we have our add to cart button. And basically what we want to do with this line is say, okay, if the item is in our cart already, we want to just say added to cart. And then if it's not in our cart, then it'll say add to cart like it does now. To do this, JavaScript has a really handy function called the find function that basically looks in an array, and it looks if something actually exists in there. And it returns basically like a 1 or a true if it finds it, or a 0 or a false if it doesn't find it. So to actually implement this, let's just do this. Let's delete this here. Let's add our curly brackets to show that we're going to write some JavaScript. And then let's call the find function on our cart that we're looking at. So we'll say cart.find, and then we want to pass in a arrow function here. And we'll say for each item in our cart, let's do something. So what are we trying to look for? Well, we're trying to see if an item in our cart matches what we just clicked to see if it's already in it or not. So what we're basically wanting to do is see if the titles are the exact same between whatever we're looking for in our cart and the product that we're looking at currently. So all we want to do here is say item.title is equal to product.title like this. So we're basically just seeing if they match. So all this is basically doing is seeing if there is a item in our cart that is equal to whatever the product is being looked at. And to write our conditional statement here, we can actually use the ternary operator that we looked at in one of the previous episodes. So to do that, let's just add a question mark here, which is going to mean if it's true. So if it's true, what do we want to display? Well, we want to display, if it's already in our cart, we should say added to cart like this. And then if it's not true, meaning it's not in our cart, we want to say what it currently says, which is just add to cart. And then let's go ahead and just save this file now. And now let's go ahead and test one of our buttons. So let's go ahead and click this button here. And that doesn't look right. So it looks like it gave us a problem there. Page is not rendering. Let's see, cart.find is not a function. Okay, so the .find function works on arrays. Let me just look. So let me make sure we're defining as an array in app.jsx. So cart here. Okay, yeah, so we're defining it to start out as an array. The only other spot where that changes, I believe, is on the products. Or no, sorry, it's in the product cart here when we're setting cart. I think I may see the issue. So this notation may not be correct. I think here we're actually turning it into an object, which is maybe why it's saying you can't call the find function on an object. So let me actually just try changing this real quick. I'm going to change this to square brackets instead of curly brackets, so it basically keeps it as an array and not as an object. I'm going to save this and let's see if that works. I'm going to try it now. So let's say add cart. And okay, sweet. So it did look like that actually fixed it. So now let's press this other button here, add it to cart, add it to cart. So you can see that hopefully it is now setting our cart correctly, and this conditional statement is working because once we added the item to our cart, it now says add it to cart instead of just add it to cart. Now we're successfully adding items to our cart. So let's actually go into our cart page now. Let's actually show the items that we have in our cart. So to do that, we can just use a simple mapping function, just like we did with the products. So to make our mapping function, let's go ahead and delete this. Let's make our curly brackets here for our map function. And all we want to do is render something for each one of the items in our cart, which is this prop here. So we'll say cart.map, and we want to pass in a function like always. And in here, we'll just say item to represent each item in the cart. Arrow function like this. And then with map function, we always want to return some JSX code. So we'll do return like this. And then now the question becomes, what do you want to turn for each cart? So I think for the sake of this, we don't need to add any sort of like buttons that show, like add a cart or anything or price because we're already in the cart. So for this, let's just actually display the items, let's say title and description. So for each one of these, I'm going to do a header 2, and let's display item.desk for description. And then we're also going to display that should be item.title. And then this one here would just be item.desk. And it's getting mad that we have two things that are being returned instead of just one like parent tag here. So let's add the empty tags here like this so it stops complaining. And we'll go ahead and just Control S this page now. And what's great is that we can see it's actually working now because we can see all three of our items displayed. And this is our cart page, so that makes sense because if you look on our products page, we have added all three of these items to our cart, hence why we're showing all three of them here. Now, what would be nice as a feature is to just have a button, for instance, that would say remove from cart, because maybe we go to our cart, realize there's something in our cart that we don't want, and we can just click a button to remove it. So to do that, let's just go into our map here, and for each item, we want to have a button that just gives you the option to remove it. So we'll say remove item like this, go ahead and save it. You can now see we've added a button here, remove item, but obviously we want it to do something. So let's actually go ahead and add an onClick function or an onClick handler that we can use to call like a handle click function. I'm making a function up here. I'm just going to call it function handle click, just like we have in our other file. And then we're going to go here and look at our onClick property. And we say onClick, let's call this handle click function. So I'll say onClick, and then we'll do an arrow function here and just handle click just like this. So whenever we click it, we are then accessing this handle click function here. Now in our handle click function, what we want to do is to obviously remove something from our cart, depending on whatever button is clicked. So there's a couple of interesting ways we can go about doing this. However, I think one of the more creative ways to do it that I can think of is using the filter method from JavaScript on an array. So basically what we could do is we could call this setCart function and then set it equal to a filter method that is equal to everything except the product that we are removing. So therefore, it is filtering it to an array without that product, basically. So what I mean by that is we can call this setCart function here. And then inside of this setCart, what we can do is call it equal to the current cart. And then we're just going to filter out whatever we don't want anymore. So we'll say cart.filter. And then inside of this, let's pass in a function. We'll say item. So we're checking our cart. And then what do we want to do here? Well, we first need to know which button was actually clicked, because on our cart now we have 3 buttons, obviously one for each product. So the only way to actually know what button is clicked is we should probably add an argument into our handle click function here. And we can specify which button was actually clicked. And the good thing is that when we're mapping out our cart here, we're already using item as our element. So let's go ahead and just add an item as an argument to our function here. And then we'll just pass in item just like this. And then just so we're not confused on naming conventions, let's actually change this to product instead of item. So we have basically this item here is representing the actual item of whatever is clicked. And then this product here is just representing the cart filter. So all we need to do here is basically say, okay, we want to filter out a certain item basically depending on what button was clicked. So we can filter it out by doing this actually. We can say filter it out where product.title is not equal to item.title, just like that. So what this is saying is filter out every item that is not equal to this. So we're basically singling out the item we are getting rid of, and then we are setting the cart to that new product. So let's go ahead and just Control S and save this page here. Now, the golden moment, let's actually go ahead and test this now to see if the remove item works. So let's go to, let's say creatine, for instance. Let's click remove item. And bam, we can see it is now removed from our cart. And if we go back and look at our products page, we can see that creatine now says add to cart because we recognize that it is no longer in our cart. So now it says add to cart. We can click that again, add to cart, and go back. And now it is back at the bottom of our list here. And notice it is doing it in order of whatever is currently in the array. So I could remove protein powder here from the cart, go back, press add to cart again, add it here, and now it's back at the bottom of the list here. Now, if you were running an actual store, you'd probably have something like a checkout button at the bottom once you have everything in your cart finalized that you want. So like, for instance, you would do something like button, and then inside of here, let's put like a big header, let's just say checkout, in all caps like this. Okay, that looks kind of ugly. Let's take away the H1 for right now. It's still gonna look kind of bad because it's not styled. But if you were an actual store, you would have a button at the bottom here that would say, I don't know, something like checkout. And then right here, once you click checkout, you would have probably some function up here that would say like function handle by. And then this function here would handle your payment processing. That's a whole thing for another video that I won't go over today because we're not doing a payment processing video. But if you were to have an actual functioning site, you want to have some payment thing here where once this button is clicked, you could use an on-click event here to access this function to handle the actual buy. Now for now, we're not actually a real store that's selling real stuff. So I'm just going to go ahead and delete this for now, just so we are left with just the cart itself, and we're not doing any fancy payment processing stuff for this app right now. Well, that's great. So we now have a fully functioning cart that can add and remove items however we would like. So now that we've got the home page done, the products page done, and the cart page done, let's go on to the easier pages and just get the About Us and Contact page finished up. Let's first head over into our About Us page. Now this page is going to be super simple. We don't need to have any fancy functionality or anything. All we're going to do here is enter in some text field that just say some random stuff about the theoretical company we're making. So I'm going to go ahead and just skip forward in the video here just after I've written all this stuff out. Okay, so I went ahead and just filled out this page just a little bit. And all I've added here is literally just text. So I added a header that said About Us. And then I added header 2s for all the little smaller tags. Like for this one, we said at Gym Supplement Store is our goal to provide blah, blah, blah. I said we were founded in 2017 to provide blah, blah, blah. And then enjoy all the products and be sure to contact us with any questions. As you can see, that displays all on this page here. Now, one thing that might be nice is because we're mentioning that be sure to contact us with any questions, we do have a contact page. So let's actually real quick just add a link on this page from React Writer DOM. Let's go ahead and just add a link to our contact page just so people can click on it if they want to go to it. So we'll add link here. Let's do a button like we've been doing with our other links in our nav bar. We'll add button here like this. And then inside this, it'll be a button just to the contact page. And the link we want to take us to is obviously /contact. So now it'll add a button down here. We click contact us and it takes you to the contacts page. And now that we're here on this contacts page, we might as well finish up the final page here. So let's go ahead and go into our contact.jsx. And let's ask ourselves, what do we want on this page? Now, normally most contact pages you see on stores are going to have something like, a field to enter your name, a field to enter your email to contact you at, and then the field to actually enter in whatever like question or comment you may have. So let's actually go ahead and just add those in. Let's go ahead and do input fields actually for all of these, because we know that all these are to be text fields because you're entering in stuff to the company. So let's just do, I'm just going to make 3 inputs here. And now we have 3 input fields. And actually, I don't think I need these closing things here. I'm just going to make singular tags here. So we'll just add in these forward slashes like this. And then one thing we can do, that's kind of a neat little trick with the React input field in JSX, is that we can add an argument called placeholder that basically just has some like string displayed in kind of like dim text inside the text box. So for instance, if I had an input field that was going to be used for, let's say their name, like this, we can just do name like that. And now you can see we have 3 text fields here, but this placeholder here is name. Obviously, when you click it and start typing, name goes away. But if it's empty, we'll just have it like this. And let's go ahead and just let's add a header up here that says, contact us below. This is me a header here. Now it's going to have 3 fields. I'm going to go ahead and add a placeholder for each one of these. So I'll add a placeholder. Let's say this one's going to be to enter your email address to contact you at. And then this last placeholder is going to be your actual like question or comment that you have. So we'll do question/comment like this, and then save it. And now we have this contact us below, and then we have a field to enter your name, a field to enter your email, and a field to enter whatever question or comment you're going to have. Now, if you remember the episode where we handled events, note how we used a handler called onChange. That was basically used to capture the input from an input field. So let's actually go ahead and do that, and let's make pieces of state for each one of the inputs that we have. So let's do one for name. We'll do name, set name, and I'll make the equals use state in a second. We'll do name or const email, set email, and then we'll also do const. We'll do comment/set comment like this, and then let's invoke our useState function. So let's go ahead and import it from React. Import useState, and then let's say equals useState. These should all probably be empty strings by default because we want them to not have anything in them. Let's say equals useState, just like this. Just go ahead and save it. So now we made state for each one of our input fields. And then just like we did in our other episode with our onChange function, let's add an onChange here and use it to actually change each one of our state variables. So let's add an onChange property with curly brackets like this. And then inside of here, all we want to do is arrow function, e.target.value. And again, basically all this is saying is that every time the input in this input field changes, so in this case, this is for the name field right here, anytime it changes, we are going to set the state, or actually here, well, I actually set the state first. Let's do this. Okay, so every time the input field changes, we are basically just setting the state to whatever is actually in the input field, which is just represented by e.target.value. So let's go ahead and add this to all of our other ones too. So we'll do copy this. We will paste it here. And then we will also paste it here. And then we'll obviously just need to change whatever state variable we're using. So this one should be set email. And then this one should be set comments like this. And now we can go ahead and save it. And anytime we now modify these fields, we're actually re-rendering our component because we are modifying the state now. And of course, if you are an actual company trying to actually let customers contact you, what you would need to do is actually submit whatever their information is. So to do that, let's just make another button. Let's just put it down at the bottom here. We'll just say button, and then inside of it, it'll just say submit. And we can go ahead and save this here. And again, it's not formatted very good. We should probably have it like below these things here, not off to the side of it. But we're not messing with CSS right now. So we'll have a button that says submit here. And then let's make a function that can actually handle the submit. So let's say function handle submit like this. And then all we want to do is basically invoke this function every time this button is clicked. So we'll say on click, and we just want to call this handle submit function. So now every time this button is clicked here, we're now accessing this function. Now, for right now, we obviously don't have an actual customer database that we're taking information from, but if you did, you could have a function inside of this here. That basically all it would do is just kind of packed it up maybe into an object and then call some backend function to send it off to your database. But for right now, we don't have that, so we're going to go ahead and skip that step. And now we actually have a pretty functional React website. It's not a very pretty one because we're not doing a lot of CSS styling, but it does work to some extent. So we have our navbar up top here that has all of our different pages from home, products, about us, contact us, and cart. On this home page, we just have some information here. We can go to our products page here. On our products page, we can look at the items that we have in our cart. which obviously we can look at here too, and we can remove them as we want. On our products page, we can add them back, of course, if we wanted to, and go back into our cart and see they're added again. On our About Us page, we just have some information about this theoretical company we're making, and it also has a link to the contact page. And on this contact page here, users can enter their name, email, and whatever question or comment, and then they can click submit to submit it to some database if we had one. And if we actually just full screen this, you can see that the app actually looks a little bit different now because of the way I did the CSS styling on the nav bar. They're a little bit more spaced apart, so that'd be something to watch out for in an actual app. But you can see we now actually do have a full site. Again, now on full screen, I'll just go through some of these pages. We have the home page here, have the products page here, about us, we have contact us, and then we have the cart page here. And then I don't know if you saw when we were scrolling through, I just realized that if we click something multiple times, even though it says added to cart, it'll still actually add it to our cart here. So you see we have a bunch of protein powders. That'd be something we could use as a potential upgrade. That could be something like in our products card file. We could basically check if it's already in there, and if it's already in there, then don't add it. But that's an upgrade that we could do potentially for this app. And with that, that pretty much wraps up today's episode. In today's episode, we built a theoretical online store that sells gym supplements by combining all of our React knowledge into one project. We use things like React Router to create pages, props to handle the flow of information, state to keep track of what's on our site, events to handle button clicks and input fields, and conditional rendering to change what we're rendering based on state. I hope you've enjoyed this course, and I certainly hope you were able to get a base knowledge of React enough to help you get started with your very own React projects. I know it can be confusing at times, especially if you don't already know JavaScript, but if you've made it this far in the course, then I commend you and highly encourage you to start your own project and push your knowledge of React even farther. I would greatly appreciate if you could subscribe to my channel, or at the very least like the video, as it helps tremendously to promote my videos to a wider audience and get them more traction. With that, we'll end this one here, and have a great rest of your day.